The wedding ring hit the floor before Madeline Cross could even step through the door of her new home. It hadn't fallen off her finger. Cole Whitaker had thrown it. Not at her. He'd yanked it from his own coat pocket where he'd been squeezing it so hard during the 3-hour wagon ride from town that the metal had left a red circle in his palm. He threw it onto the kitchen table the way a man throws down losing cards. And he said, without turning around to look at her, "Put that on. People are already talking." Madeline stood in the doorway of Blackthorn Ridge Ranch with one bag in her hand and mud on her boots, and looked at the ring spinning on the scratched wood of that table, and she thought, "This is the man I married this morning." She picked up the ring. She put it on. Her hand didn't shake, but everything else in her was shaking, and she would spend the next year making sure nobody ever saw it. If you've ever walked into a room where everyone already decided you were going to fail, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And stay with me until the very end, because what happens to Madeline Cross is the kind of thing that changes how you think about strength. Let's begin. The town of Harrow Bend had been talking about the Whitaker wedding for 6 weeks before it happened. Not because anyone was excited, because everyone thought it was the funniest thing they'd heard in years. Cole Whitaker, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a closed door and the kind of silence that made men nervous, was one of the most sought-after bachelors in 3 counties. He'd inherited Blackthorn Ridge from his father, a man who'd built the ranch from nothing and died of a heart attack at 51, still believing it would outlast him by 100 years. Cole had inherited the land, the cattle, the reputation, and also, though nobody talked about it openly, the debt. The Cross family debt, specifically. 17 years ago, Hector Cross had borrowed $11,000 from Edmund Whitaker to save his failing wheat farm. Edmund had been generous about it, maybe too generous, and by the time Edmund died and Cole inherited everything, that debt had turned into a legal arrangement that neither family had expected. A marriage contract, old-fashioned and binding, written in Edmund's own hand, witnessed and notarized, stating that if the debt could not be repaid, the eldest unmarried daughter of Hector Cross would marry the eldest unmarried son of Edmund Whitaker. Hector Cross had 4 daughters. He had no money. Cole Whitaker had the contract, and he had creditors of his own breathing down his neck. So on a Tuesday morning in October, Cole Whitaker married Madeline Cross in the Harrow Bend courthouse, with a judge, 2 witnesses, and approximately 40 townspeople who had shown up not to celebrate but to watch. Madeline was 28. She was the second oldest Cross daughter, not the eldest, but her older sister Clara had married a man in Denver 2 years prior, which meant the contract, technically, passed to her. Her father had explained this to her at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes somewhere else entirely, and Madeline had listened to every word and then said, "All right, Pa," and gone to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without moving. She wasn't beautiful in the way the frontier rewarded beauty. She wasn't small and quick and sharp-boned. She was tall, broad in the hips and shoulders, with dark hair that never stayed pinned and hands that were already roughened from years of farm work. When she walked into the courthouse that morning in her best dress, green wool let out at the seams twice over the years, she heard someone in the crowd say, loud enough to carry, "Poor Cole." He really drew the short straw. Cole had stood at the front of the room with his hat in his hands and his face perfectly empty. He hadn't looked at her when she walked in. He'd looked at the wall. She had looked at him, though. She'd looked at the set of his shoulders and the way his jaw worked, and she thought, he's humiliated. He's not cruel. He's just humiliated. It didn't make the ring hitting the table any easier, but it helped her understand what she was dealing with. The ranch house at Blackthorn Ridge was not what she'd imagined, which was fine, because she hadn't let herself imagine much. The porch railing was rotted through on one side. 2 windows on the east wall were boarded up. The barn she could see from the door had a roof that sagged in the middle like a man with a broken back. The smell of the place was dust and old wood and something underneath that, a sourness, like work that had been abandoned too long ago and had started going bad. Cole walked past her into the house without another word. She could hear him moving through the rooms, opening and closing things, restless in the way of a man who didn't know what to do with himself. Madeline set her bag down next to the door and did not sit. She stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, taking it in. The fireplace was cold. The curtains were gray with dust. There was a coffee cup on the windowsill that had been there long enough to leave a ring-shaped stain in the wood. She was still standing there when Cole came back into the room and found her. "I'll show you the bedroom," he said. His voice was flat. Not mean, just flat. The voice of a man who was getting through the day on the minimum amount of words required. "The roof on the barn," she said. He stopped. "What about it?" "It's going to collapse before spring if nobody fixes the supports. I could see it from the door." He looked at her for what might have been the first time since the courthouse. Really looked at her. His eyes were gray, she noticed, and tired in a way that went past one bad night's sleep. "I'm aware of the roof. Are you fixing it?" "I haven't had the money to fix it." "Have you had the men to fix it? It doesn't take money if you've got enough hands willing to work." Something moved across his face, irritation, but also surprise. "I've got 4 ranch hands and they're all behind on 3 other jobs." "Who's the foreman?" "Man named Deke Pryor. He's been with the ranch 12 years. I'd like to meet him tomorrow morning." Cole's mouth closed and opened again. I was a man who was used to being the one who ended conversations, and she'd just rearranged something on him. "You'd like to meet the foreman?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "And I'd like a list of what's been deferred on the property. Repairs, payments, supplier contracts. Whatever you can put together tonight." "I didn't marry you to run this ranch." "I know," she said. She kept her voice even. "You married me because you had a contract and a debt and no better options. I understand that. But I'm here now, and I can either sit in this house and be decorative, or I can help you keep it from falling apart. Which one do you want?" The silence that followed was the longest she'd ever sat inside of. She could hear the wind coming through somewhere. A gap in the wall, maybe, or one of those boarded windows not quite sealed. "The list," Cole finally said, "is going to be long." "I figured." He left the room. She exhaled slowly, very quietly, and then she picked up her bag and went to find the bedroom herself. Deke Pryor was 51 years old and had the face of a man who had been weathered by every force the frontier offered and had stopped being impressed by any of them. He met Madeline the next morning at the barn, the broken-roofed barn, which she had insisted on, with his hat pushed back and his thumbs hooked in his belt, and an expression that wasn't quite a smirk, but was working toward one. "So you're the new Mrs.," he said. "Madeline Whitaker," she said. "You've been foreman here 12 years? That's right. And the roof's been sagging for how long?" He shifted his weight. "Year or 2. Why hasn't it been fixed?" "Mr. Whitaker said to leave it until spring." "If you leave it until spring, it won't be there in spring. You know that." Deke looked at her the way men looked at things that had surprised them and weren't sure yet how they felt about it. "I know that." "Then why didn't you push back?" "Back? Not my place to push back." "It is your place," she said. "You're the foreman. That means this is your problem before it's anybody else's. The barn goes, the cattle have nowhere to winter. The cattle have nowhere to winter, you lose the herd. You lose the herd." She let that finish itself. Deke was quiet. Around them, 2 of the ranch hands had drifted close enough to hear without pretending otherwise. She didn't acknowledge them. She kept her eyes on Deke. "The supports on the east side can be reinforced this week," she said. "Not rebuilt, reinforced. That buys you through winter. What do you have on hand for timber?" "Some. Not much." "Enough?" He chewed his lower lip, thinking. "Maybe." "Then let's take a look at what you've got." She walked past him into the barn. There was a beat. She felt it in the air, that moment when men decide whether to follow or dig in. And then Deke Pryor followed her. The 2 ranch hands looked at each other. By the end of that first week, she had walked every inch of the property she could reach on foot. She had cataloged, in a small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket, every fence line that needed attention, every water trough that was cracked or dry, every section of pasture that had been overgrazed until the ground was hard as pottery. She had sat at the kitchen table 3 nights running with Cole's account book spread in front of her and worked through numbers that made her stomach hurt. The ranch wasn't just in debt. It was bleeding from a dozen small wounds at once. The supplier contracts Cole had inherited from his father were outdated and badly skewed. They were paying 30% above market for hay and feed because Edmund Whitaker had made gentlemen's agreements with local merchants who had then quietly raised their prices over the years. knowing Cole wouldn't check. The cattle operation was running on instinct rather than strategy, with no rotation system for the grazing pastures, which meant the land was deteriorating season by season. And there was a neighbor, a rancher named Gerald Brandt, who owned the largest spread adjacent to Blackthorn Ridge, who had been making quiet offers to buy Cole out for the past 2 years. Madeline had found the letters in the bottom drawer of Cole's desk. 3 of them, each more generous than the last, each with a line near the end that read like a compliment and worked like a knife. Given the current state of Blackthorn Ridge's operations, this offer represents a fair valuation that protects your family's dignity. She'd read that line 3 times. Then she'd closed the drawer and gone back to the account books. Cole noticed what she was doing. She could tell because he watched her in a way that was different from how he'd watched her that first day. Less closed, more uncertain, like a man trying to solve a problem he hadn't expected to be presented with. He asked questions occasionally, carefully, the way people ask questions when they're not sure they want the answers. "The Halverson account," he said one night, standing in the doorway of the kitchen while she had papers spread across the table. "What did you find?" "They've been overcharging you by about $40 a month for 2 years," she said, not looking up, "on the feed contract." "That's impossible. Halverson and my father—" "Your father is gone." She said it without cruelty, just flatly. "Halverson figured out you weren't checking. I don't know if he planned it from the start or if it crept up on him, but either way, you've been paying it." Cole was quiet long enough that she finally looked up. His face had gone through something. Not anger exactly, but something rawer than that. The particular hurt of discovering that someone you trusted was smaller than you believed. "Can you prove it?" he said. "I've already written it out, 3 pages, dates, amounts, the original contract terms versus what you've been billed." She held up the papers. "If you want to take it to him, you'll have everything you need." He took the papers. He stood there reading them with his brow furrowed and the lamplight making shadows under his eyes. And Madeline watched him and thought, not for the first time, he's not a bad man. He's a man who was never taught to look. He left without saying anything. But the next morning, he came downstairs and said, "I'm going to town to see Halverson." And the way he said it, like a decision, like someone who had decided, was different from any way he'd spoken to her before. He didn't tell her what happened in that meeting. He came back in the late afternoon and put his hat on its hook and washed his hands and came to dinner and ate. And at the end of the meal, he said, without preamble, "Halverson's going to refund 8 months, says it was a misunderstanding." 8 months isn't 2 years, she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "But it's what I could get today." She nodded. That was honest enough. "There are 2 more contracts like that," she said. "I'll have the documentation ready by Friday." He looked at her across the table with that uncertain expression again, the one she was starting to think was just his face when he was genuinely trying to understand something. "Why are you doing this?" "Because this is my home now," she said, "whether either of us planned it that way." Word got around Harrow Bend the way word always does, sideways and faster than anyone intends. By the end of the first month, people knew that the new Whitaker wife had confronted 3 suppliers and renegotiated 2 contracts and was seen every morning out in the pastures with Deke Pryor and a notebook, walking fence lines and taking measurements. The reaction was not admiration, not yet. At the general store where Madeline went for supplies. Every other Thursday, she heard the conversations go quiet when she walked in and restart at a lower register when she moved away. She caught fragments, acting like she owns the place. And Cole must be desperate if he's letting her. And once, from a woman she'd thought might have been friendly. It won't last. Girls like that always overreach. She bought her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and she said good morning and thank you, and she drove the wagon back to Blackthorn Ridge without letting any of it show. But she heard it. She heard all of it. And she stored it away in the same place she stored everything. That interior space she'd built over years of being the cross daughter who was too big, too opinionated, too much. And she let it settle into something that wasn't bitterness, exactly, but was very close to fuel. Gerald Brandt came to call on a Wednesday afternoon. He was a tall man, older, with white at his temples, and the easy confidence of someone who had been prosperous long enough to forget what the other side felt like. He had a smile that arrived slightly before the rest of him, like a scout sent ahead. He asked for Cole and was told Cole was out on the south pasture. He looked at Madeline. "I can come back. he said. You can also sit down, she said. He sat. She poured coffee. He talked about the weather and the cattle market and how he'd heard good things about her, which was the politest lie she'd heard since the wedding. And eventually, with the ease of a man who has done this many times, he arrived at what he'd actually come to say. I have an offer in, he said, for the property. I imagine Cole's shown you. He has. It's a generous number. It's a fair number for a failing ranch, she said. Blackthorn Ridge isn't failing anymore. Brant studied her. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. That's an optimistic view. It's an accurate one. She met his eyes steadily. The operational costs are down 14% in the last 3 weeks alone. The east pasture's on a rotation schedule now. We'll have the barn roof stabilized before the first hard freeze. She paused. The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Brant. He set down his cup. Perhaps you should let Cole make that determination. Perhaps you should hear it from him directly then. She stood. I'll tell him you came by. Brant left. Madeline stood at the window and watched his horse until it disappeared over the rise, and then she let out a long breath and sat back down and stared at the wall. The problem with Gerald Brant, she was beginning to understand, was not that he was making offers. It was that someone had been helping him know when to make them. Those letters in Cole's drawer, they had arrived at very specific moments. One after a particularly bad summer, when the well in the north pasture had run dry. One after a dispute with a cattle buyer that had cost Cole a significant sale. One right after Cole had paid the largest installment on the Cross family debt, leaving him cash thin and stretched. Someone had been telling Brant exactly when Cole was most vulnerable. She went back to the account books that night. She sat there for 4 hours after Cole had gone to bed, and she started looking not for overcharges or outdated contracts, but for patterns, for timing, for the spaces between things, for the shape of what she couldn't see yet. By the time the lamp oil ran low, she had found something. It was small, a name that appeared twice in the records, once as a witness on an amended supplier contract, once on a letter of credit arrangement that she hadn't paid enough attention to before. The name was not Brant's, but it was connected to Brant, connected the way things are when someone wants the connection to be hard to see. She closed the account books and sat in the dark kitchen for a moment. Then she opened the notebook to a clean page and started writing. She didn't know yet how deep it went. She didn't know how many people were involved or how long it had been running or how far the rot reached. She knew she was a woman who had been married for 6 weeks and had no official standing to investigate anything or accuse anyone and would not be taken seriously if she tried. She also knew that she had already rebuilt the supply contracts, stabilized the barn, renegotiated the creditor schedule, and turned a ranch that everyone in Harrow Bend had written off into something that at least had a fighting chance. And she had done all of it while those same people were laughing at her. So she wrote down the name. And under it, she wrote the date, and the contract number, and the 2 small facts that didn't line up the way they were supposed to. It wasn't much, but she'd built things from less. Outside, the wind moved across the dark land of Blackthorn Ridge, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out once and went quiet. Madeline Cross, Madeline Whitaker, sat at her kitchen table with her notebook and her lamp nearly out, and she was not afraid. She was paying attention, and that, she had learned a long time ago, was always where it started. The name in the notebook was Ryland Foss. Madeline had written it down twice that night because she didn't trust her own memory when she was tired, and she was tired in the way that goes past physical, the kind of tired that settles into your thinking and makes you doubt what you're seeing. So she wrote it twice, and she underlined it once, and in the morning she looked at it again in the daylight, and it still didn't belong where she'd found it. Ryland Foss was a land broker. She'd heard his name in passing since arriving in Harrow Bend, the kind of name that came up in conversations about property and deals, the way a bad smell comes up in a room before you can identify its source. He had an office on the north end of town, above the feed merchant, and he wore his success the way men do when they've gotten it by watching other people lose. He had a good coat and clean hands and a reputation for knowing which properties were about to come available before they were officially for sale. Now she understood why. But understanding why and being able to do something about it were 2 entirely different things, and Madeline Cross had been alive long enough to know the difference. She folded the notebook and put it in her coat pocket and went downstairs to start the coffee. Cole was already up, which surprised her. He was usually out the door before she came down, the kind of man who treated Dawn like a personal obligation. But he was sitting at the kitchen table with his coat still on and a piece of paper in front of him, and when she came in, he looked up with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the empty flatness of those first days, not the careful uncertainty of recent weeks. This was something rawer. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He pushed the paper across the table. It was a letter, new, not from the desk drawer, the ink still sharp and black. The heading bore a name she recognized, Consolidated Cattle Trust of Kansas City. She read it. It took her 2 passes because the language was deliberately dense, the kind of legal-adjacent prose designed to bury the actual news inside enough words that you had to excavate for it. But she found it. The trust was calling in a loan, not a supplier debt, not a gentleman's agreement, a formal loan, $11,000, taken out 18 months ago with Blackthorn Ridge as collateral. The loan was due in full within 60 days. "You didn't tell me about this," she said. "I forgot about it." His voice was flat but not defensive. "That's not an excuse. I took the loan when I thought I could pay it back in 6 months, and then things got worse, and I kept pushing it forward in my head thinking I'd find a way. And then you came, and things started getting better, and I thought maybe—" He stopped. "I thought maybe I had more time." Madeline set the letter down. 60 days. $11,000. The ranch's operating account had perhaps $1,200. "Did you know this loan existed when you took it?" she asked. "What? I mean, did someone suggest it to you? Point you toward the trust specifically?" He frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Humor me." Cole thought about it, and she watched the moment it landed on him, the slight tightening around his eyes. "Ryland Foss," he said. "He mentioned the trust when I was looking for bridge financing. He said they were good about ranch collateral." She put her hand flat on the table. There it was. "Foss is connected to Gerald Brandt," she said. Cole stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "I found it last night in the records. His name on 2 documents, in places it has no good reason to be. And Brandt's letters. The timing of them, Cole. Every one of those letters came right after a disaster. Someone was telling Brandt when to move." The silence in the kitchen was different now. Not the silence of 2 people who don't know each other, but the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something larger than either of them expected. "You're saying Foss has been feeding Brandt information," Cole said slowly, "and steering me toward loans that would push me under on a schedule." "I'm saying it looks that way." She kept her voice steady. "I could be wrong. I haven't proved anything yet." "But you don't think you're wrong?" She looked at him directly. "No." Cole stood up and went to the window. He stood there with his back to her for a long moment, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the particular tension of a man who is revising his entire understanding of the past 2 years. That was not a comfortable process. She didn't rush it. "What do we do?" he finally said. "We figure out how to stay afloat for 60 days. And then we figure out everything else." The 60-day problem was not simple, but it was concrete, and concrete problems were the kind Madeline preferred. Abstract ones, questions of reputation, community standing, what people thought of her, those she could do nothing about, but a number she could work with. She started the next morning. She went to Deke Pryor before breakfast and told him they needed to talk about the cattle. Deke was not a man who warmed easily. He'd grown less hostile over the weeks. She'd earned that much. But there was still a guardedness in him, a habit of waiting to see what she was really after before he committed to anything. She respected it, actually. A man who gave his trust away quick wasn't worth much in hard country. "The stock we've got," she said. "The Hereford crosses in the south pasture. What's their condition right now?" "Fair to good," Deke said. "Better than they were 2 months ago, now that the grazing's rotated. If we brought 4 of the best bulls to market early, before winter, what could we get?" He calculated. "Early sale's a gamble. Prices are usually lower in November." "I know that. What's the number?" He told her. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. "What about the 2 sections of fallow land on the northeast boundary?" she said. "Is there any reason we couldn't lease those for winter grazing to one of the smaller outfits nearby? Someone who lost pasture this year?" Deke looked at her. "The Murphys lost their east field to that prairie fire in September. Would they pay for use of the northeast sections?" "Might," he paused, "if you offered fair terms." "Draw it up," she said. A 3-month lease, rate to be negotiated. I'll go out and talk to Tom Murphy this week. Deke was quiet for a moment. You know people are going to say you're selling off pieces of the ranch. People are already saying things about me, she said. I've stopped expecting that to stop. Something shifted in Deke's face. Not quite a smile, because Deke Pryor did not appear to own one, but something in the territory of respect. He nodded once and went to find his ledger book. The Murphy visit was harder than she anticipated, not because Tom Murphy was unkind, but because he was proud. The way men who've had a difficult year are proud. Carefully, painfully, right at the surface. He was 45 and rangy, with a wife named Bess who sat at the kitchen table and listened to the whole conversation without saying anything until the end. Lease feels like charity, Tom said. It's not charity, Madeline said. You pay me, I get capital I need, your cattle have winter pasture. Both sides want something. That's commerce. It'd be charity if you charged below rate. I'm charging exactly rate. Deke Pryor set the number. Tom looked at his wife. Bess Murphy was a woman somewhere in her late 40s with a practical face and sharp eyes, and she looked back at her husband with an expression that said, "Stop making this difficult." All right, Tom said. 3 months. She shook his hand and drove the wagon back to Blackthorn Ridge in the late afternoon with the sun going sideways across the plains. And she let herself feel, for exactly the length of that drive, that she was doing something right. Then she pulled up to the barn, and Deke met her at the gate with his hat in his hand and an expression that told her the feeling was going to be brief. Had visitors, he said, while you were out. Who? 3 men. Didn't give names. Asked to see Mr. Whitaker. I told them he was working. They said they'd be back. Did they say who sent them? Deke put his hat back on. Didn't have to. 2 of them I've seen before. They work out of Brant's spread. She stood in the yard for a moment with the reins loose in her hands. 3 men, no names. A message delivered by showing up. Where's Cole? She said. Still on the south pasture. When he comes in, tell him I need to talk to him before dinner. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and opened the notebook. She was building something in there, not just names and dates and numbers, but a map of relationships, of who knew whom and who owed what and where the connections ran. It was the same skill she'd used running the Cross Family Farms account since she was 16, tracking which neighboring farms her father traded labor with, and which ones he'd borrowed from, and who was reliable, and who always found a reason to not be available when the hard work came. She'd always had a facility for seeing the shape underneath the surface of things. Nobody had ever thought to call it a skill. It was just something Madeline did, quiet and unacknowledged, the way women's labor so often went. Now she was using it to map a conspiracy. In a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood, in a house that wasn't quite hers yet, but was becoming more hers every day. Cole came in just after dark, tired and smelling of horses and cold air, and she told him about the 3 men while he washed his hands at the basin. He was still for a moment when she finished. They're pushing, he said. Yes. Brant knows about the trust letter. She'd been thinking the same thing. Foss would have told him. If Foss knows when the loan comes due, he's known for a while. He's been waiting. Cole dried his hands and turned around. We can't prove any of this, Madeline. Not yet. And if we go around accusing Brant and Foss without proof, I know, she said. It makes us look desperate or unstable, which is exactly what they want. She had already thought through this. She'd thought through it twice. We don't say anything publicly yet. We just have to make sure we're still standing in 60 days. Cole sat down across from her. He looked like a man who was in the middle of revising something fundamental about himself and hadn't finished the revision yet. His face was tired and a little uncertain, still, but there was something else underneath it now. A quality she hadn't seen before in him. Attention. He was paying attention to her, not as a problem to manage or a wife he'd inherited along with a debt, as a person who was thinking things through that mattered. The 2 ranch hands you let go last spring, she said. Hennessy and the other one, Crane. What about them? Why'd they leave? He frowned. I had to cut wages. They moved on. Or someone offered them more to move on. Cole stared at her. Deke mentioned it once, offhand, she said. Said it was strange timing, both of them going in the same week. I thought it was just the wage cut. But now I'm wondering if Brant's people went to them first, made it worth their while to leave, 4 hands instead of 6 makes everything harder and slower. That would mean this has been running longer than I thought. Yes, she said. It would. Cole put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his forehead and stayed like that for a moment. She let him. This was a man discovering that the trouble he'd thought was bad luck, and his own failures was, in significant part, something else entirely. That was disorienting in ways that couldn't be processed fast. I don't know what to do, he said. It cost him to say it. She could hear it. You don't have to know right now, she said. I'm working on it. He looked up. You've been working on it since you got here. Yes. And I didn't ask you to. No. Why? He asked. And it was the same question he'd asked before, but different now. More open, less guarded. The question of a man who actually wanted the answer rather than a man who was challenging her to defend herself. She thought about it honestly. She could have given him the clean version, because this is my home now. And it would have been true as far as it went. But it didn't go far enough. Because I know what it looks like when something decent is being eaten from the inside, she said. I watched it happen to my father's farm for years. I watched it, and I was too young and had no power to stop it, and eventually there was nothing left. She kept her voice even. I'm not too young anymore, and I won't watch it again if I can help it. Cole didn't say anything, but he was still looking at her with that attention, that particular, focused, considering attention, and she thought it was possible that was the most honest thing she'd said to him since the courthouse. By the 3rd week, the ranch hands were the visible problem. There were 4 of them, Deke, who was the foreman, and a law unto himself, a young man named Artie, who was 23 and competent and generally did whatever Deke told him, an older hand named Walt, who had a bad knee and worse opinions about women giving instructions, and a man named Creedy, who had been at Blackthorn Ridge for 8 months, and who Madeline had been watching with the particular care she gave to things that didn't quite add up. Creedy was good at his work. Too good. In a way that had nothing to do with ranch hands and everything to do with someone performing the role of ranch hand without being entirely committed to it. He asked too many questions that weren't about the work in front of him. Questions about the account books, about suppliers, about which pasture sections were most valuable. He framed them casually, conversationally, the way you frame things when you want to appear uninterested in the answers. She'd mentioned it to Deke. I noticed, Deke said. He said it in the particular way of a man who had noticed something and kept it to himself while he figured out what to do with it, which she understood. Has he said anything specific? Nothing I could pin down, just questions. I need to know, she said carefully, if he's sending information out. I can't search his belongings, and I wouldn't, but if you see him talking to anyone from Brant's outfit, I need to know immediately. Deke gave her a long look. You think Brant's got a man in our yard? I think it's possible. And if he does, then we decide what to do about it. Walt was the simpler problem. I was not a spy. He was just a man from an older generation who had strong feelings about who was qualified to give orders on a ranch, and a woman, in his understanding, was not qualified. He hadn't been outwardly disrespectful. He'd been careful about that, which told her he wasn't stupid. But there was a specific way he had of waiting a beat too long before moving on her instructions, a way of looking at Deke for confirmation before acting that he did not do when Cole gave the same instruction. She addressed it directly, which was the only way she knew how. Walt, she said one afternoon when they were both at the fence line and alone, I've noticed you've been checking with Deke before you act on what I ask. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been caught doing something he doesn't think should count as catching. Deke's the foreman. He is, and you can absolutely run things by him if you're unsure about a task. But you're not doing that when Cole gives you the same instruction. She kept her tone level, not confrontational. I'm not asking you to like this arrangement. I'm asking you to work with it while you're on this ranch. Walt was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man weighing his pride against his paycheck and trying to figure out which one he could afford to spend. Mrs. Whitaker, he said finally, with a difficulty that suggested the words cost him something. I'll do my job. That's all I'm asking, she said. It wasn't fixed, but it was better. The early cattle sale went through in the last days of October. 4 Hereford bulls sold at a price below what they'd have fetched in spring, but higher than Deke's conservative estimate, Because Madeline had gone to the sale herself and done the negotiating, which nobody at the stockyard had expected and which had worked, partly because nobody had expected it. The Murphy lease payment came in on schedule. She had consolidated two other supplier contracts, cutting their monthly operating costs by a number that was not dramatic but was real. They were not going to make $11,000 in 60 days, she knew that. But she was building something else, something that didn't go into the account books. She was building a paper trail, every conversation with a supplier, every adjusted contract, every record of the Murphy lease and the cattle sale. She was documenting all of it in duplicate, one copy filed in the house and one she kept in a separate location that wasn't the house, because she had started to think about what would happen if someone decided that the records at Blackthorn Ridge needed to disappear. It was the kind of thinking that was either paranoid or necessary, and she wouldn't know which until later. She was also writing letters, carefully, quietly, to other ranchers in the region, people she'd heard Cole mention, people whose names came up in conversations about reliability and straight dealing. She was not asking for help. She was introducing herself, explaining what she and Cole were doing with the ranch's management, asking questions about shared challenges with suppliers and grazing rights and water access. She was building a picture of the landscape, of who was struggling and how and why, and she was listening for the shape of a pattern she suspected was larger than Blackthorn Ridge. 3 ranchers wrote back within 2 weeks. 2 of them mentioned similar troubles with supply pricing. One of them, a woman named Iris Calloway, who ran a modest operation 40 miles north and who wrote with a bluntness that Madeline liked immediately, mentioned Ryland Foss by name. "That man has been in the business of finding distressed properties for 20 years, Iris wrote. "Funny how often properties get distressed right after he's been sniffing around." Madeline read that letter 4 times and then added Iris Calloway to the map in her notebook. November arrived with a hard frost and a wind that meant business, and Gerald Brandt arrived 2 days later, again on a Wednesday, again asking for Cole. This time, Cole was in the house. Madeline watched the 2 men in the front room from the kitchen doorway, not hiding, but not intruding either. Staying in that space where she could hear everything, and Brandt couldn't quite decide whether she was close enough that he needed to account for her presence. Brandt made his offer. It was higher than the letters, significantly higher, which told Madeline that he had done the math on the trust loan and calculated how much a desperate man could be nudged toward accepting. Cole listened to the whole thing without speaking. Then he said, "I'll need to think about it." Brandt nodded, all warmth and patience. "Of course. But the offer won't stay open indefinitely. These things have a season, you understand." After he left, Cole stood in the middle of the front room and looked at Madeline. "That number would cover the trust loan," he said, "with some left over." "Yes," she said. So. She came into the room and sat in the chair nearest the window. "If you want to sell, Cole, that's your decision. This is your ranch. I can't make that choice for you, and I wouldn't try." He was quiet for a moment. But Brandt's been working to put you in a position where you feel like you have no choice. The loan, losing your hands, the supplier contracts bleeding you slowly. And I don't think a man who's been engineering your failure for 2 years is offering you a fair price just because he's decided to be generous. You think there's something wrong with the land." She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully, from several angles, and what she'd landed on was a suspicion she couldn't yet prove. "I think there's something he wants that's worth more than what he's offering you. Possibly water rights on the northeast boundary. Possibly something else." She looked at him steadily. "But I don't have proof yet." Cole walked to the window and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the land in the gray November light. Blackthorn Ridge in winter was stark and unbeautiful. The grass gone to dead gold, the sky pressed down low, the fences running in straight dark lines across everything like stitches holding something together. "My father built this place," he said. "He wasn't always right, and he wasn't always kind, and the debt he put around our necks with the Cross family it wasn't fair, to you or to me." He paused. "But he built it. He put his hands on every post in those fences." Madeline didn't say anything. "I don't want to sell," Cole said. "I want to tell you that clearly. I don't want to sell." "Then we figure out another way." "We might not be able to." "We might not," she agreed. "But we haven't run out of road yet." He turned from the window and looked at her in that direct, considering way that she had come to recognize as his version of trust. Not easy, not handed out freely, but real. What's the next step? I need to go to the county land records office, she said. And I need to go alone, and I need to go soon before anyone realizes what I'm looking for. What are you looking for? She was quiet for a moment. The northeast boundary. Who's filed on adjacent land in the last 3 years? Whether there's been any survey work done that we don't know about. He absorbed this. If Brant's already filed on something adjacent, then we'll know something important, she said. Either way. The land records office was in the county seat, 2 hours by wagon, and she went on a Thursday when Cole was occupied and Deke was managing the ranch, and there was no reason for anyone to note her absence and find it significant. She sat in the small, cold office with a clerk who was politely bewildered by what she was asking for, and worked through the records herself, filing through land plats and survey documents and filing records with the systematic patience she'd applied to the account books, looking for the thing that didn't belong. She found it in less than 2 hours. There had been a geological survey conducted on land adjacent to Blackthorn Ridge's northeast boundary 14 months ago. Not on Blackthorn land, adjacent. The survey had been commissioned by a holding company out of Kansas City. The holding company had a managing partner listed in its founding documents. The managing partner was Ryland Foss. The survey was for mineral rights assessment. She sat with that for a long time in the cold office, with the clerk moving around in the background and the wind pressing against the single window, and the implications of what she was looking at settling into her like cold water. It wasn't water rights. It wasn't grazing land. It wasn't even the cattle. There was something underneath the northeast boundary of Blackthorn Ridge, something that a geological survey had identified 14 months ago, and Gerald Brant had been systematically dismantling the ranch's viability ever since, because a struggling owner sells cheap and a desperate owner sells fast, and a man who loses his ranch to a foreclosed loan on 60 days' notice has very little say in what happens to the land afterward. She copied down every relevant document number in the notebook. Her handwriting was steady. Her hands were not. She drove home in the dark, arriving past supper, and found Cole waiting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold. She sat down and told him everything. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Cole sat across from her with his jaw set and his eyes doing the work of a man reconstructing the past 2 years of his life through a lens he hadn't known he needed. The northeast boundary, he said finally. There's a mineral vein there. My father mentioned it once, years ago, said a survey had suggested coal deposits, but nothing had been confirmed. It's confirmed now, Madeline said. Someone else's survey. Someone who's been planning this long enough to arrange a survey, set up a holding company, and spend the better part of 2 years making sure the man who owns that land is too broke and beaten down to notice. Cole was very still. If we lose the ranch to the trust loan, Brant or Foss buys it at distressed price, either directly or through the holding company. The Cole rights come with the land. She spread her hands flat on the table. The loan isn't just a loan, Cole. It was a mechanism. Foss put you in it. He's the one who suggested the trust. He knew exactly when it would come due. The thing that crossed Cole Whitaker's face then was not something she had a single word for. It was the particular expression of a man who has been deceived by someone he considered, if not a friend, then at least a neutral party, and who is now calculating not just the financial damage, but the more personal one, the damage to his understanding of himself as someone who could read people and situations. A man like Cole, who prided himself on a kind of frontier self-reliance, took that kind of realization hard. What do we do? He said. His voice was different now. Not the earlier helpless version of the question, or the cautious one. This version had something harder in it. We have the documents, she said. The survey commission, the holding company records, the timing of the trust loan recommendation. It's not everything, but it's enough to start a conversation with the right people. She paused. And I know someone who might be willing to help make that conversation official. She told him about Iris Calloway. He listened to all of it, the letters, the other ranchers she'd been corresponding with, the pattern she'd been mapping for weeks, the shape of what she believed was a coordinated scheme running across multiple properties in the region. He listened the way he'd been learning to listen, without interrupting, without the reflex to redirect toward what he already knew. When she finished, he said, "You've been doing all of this since the first week." "Since the second week," she said. The first week I was figuring out the barn roof. He almost smiled. It was close enough that she counted it. Iris Calloway is 40 miles north, he said, and you haven't met her. I know. And you're going to write to her and ask her to get involved in this. She's already involved, Madeline said. She just doesn't know the whole shape of it yet. Cole picked up his cold coffee cup and looked at it and set it back down. There's something I should say to you. She waited. When you first got here, he said, I wasn't fair to you. I don't mean the ring. His jaw worked. I mean how I thought about this. About you. I thought you were going to be a problem I had to manage. Another thing going wrong in a long list of things going wrong. He stopped, started again. I was wrong about that. I know, she said. I'm telling you anyway. I know that too. She met his eyes. It's noted. He nodded once, which for Cole Whitaker was approximately equivalent to a speech. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving across the dark ranch with the particular restlessness of a winter that hasn't fully committed yet, still making up its mind about how hard it intends to come down. Madeline sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to the page with Ryland Foss's name on it, and she started writing the letter to Iris Calloway. She wrote carefully. She chose her words with the same care she'd used on everything since arriving at this broken-down, beautiful, beleaguered piece of land. With precision and without sentiment, and with the absolute certainty that every word she put on paper from this point forward was going to matter. They had the documents. They had the pattern. She was beginning to believe, something that looked very much like a case. What they didn't have yet was time. And Gerald Brandt, she was equally certain, knew exactly how many days were left on that clock. Iris Calloway's reply came 11 days later, which was fast for 40 miles, and a woman who Madeline suspected didn't waste words on anything she hadn't thought through completely. The letter was 3 pages, written in a hand that was small and dense and entirely without ornamentation. Iris confirmed what Madeline had suspected, that Foss had approached her 2 years ago about selling a section of her northeast range, that she'd declined, and that within 6 months she'd had supplier trouble she'd never fully traced to a source. She hadn't connected it to Foss until Madeline's letter laid out the pattern. I thought I was just having a bad run of luck, Iris wrote. Ranchers are superstitious about that. We'd rather believe in bad luck than believe someone's been working against us, because bad luck is impersonal, and what you're describing is not. At the bottom of the 3rd page, below her signature, she had written 4 additional names. Other ranchers. With a single line beside each. Similar trouble. Worth talking to. Madeline read that list twice, and then folded the letter and held it against the table with her palm, and let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular relief of being believed by someone who had no reason to simply take her word for it. Then she picked up her pen and started writing 4 more letters. She didn't tell Cole about Iris's reply immediately, not because she was keeping it from him, but because he was in the middle of a fight of his own, and she didn't want to pull his attention in 2 directions at once. The fight was with the trust. Specifically with the Trust's regional representative, a man named Aldous Peck, who had arrived from Kansas City 2 weeks earlier and taken a room at the Harrow Bend Hotel, and who was, in Madeline's estimation, a man who had been told what outcome he was there to produce and was now going through the procedural motions of pretending there were other options. Peck had come to the ranch once already. He was 38, unremarkable in the way of men who work in offices and have learned to make that seem like authority. He'd sat in the front room and discussed the loan in the language of finance, which is a language specifically designed to make things that are being done to you sound like things that are happening naturally and inevitably, like weather. Cole had sat through it with his jaw tight and said very little, which Madeline had taken as a good sign. A man who talks when he's angry makes mistakes. A man who goes quiet is thinking. After Peck left, Cole said, "He's going to foreclose." "Yes," Madeline said. "Even if we come up with part of the money. He's not there to negotiate. He's there to collect or foreclose, and the foreclosure has been arranged in advance." She said it plainly, because she thought Cole needed plain right now more than he needed managed. The trust isn't acting alone on this. Someone has told them that Blackthorn Ridge is worth more than the loan, that they'll be compensated for the foreclosure. Foss, probably. Or Brandt directly. Cole looked at her. "Can you prove that?" "Not yet. But I'm working on it." He stood up and went to the window, which was where he went when he needed to think, and didn't want to be watched doing it. She gave him the window. She'd learned when to give him the window. "How long do we have?" he said. 31 days. He was quiet for a long moment. "Madeline, if this doesn't work—" "I know," she said. "I mean, I don't want you to have come here and put all of this into something that—" "Cole." She waited until he turned around. "I didn't do this for the ranch. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I don't know how to do anything halfway. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and we figure out what's next. But it's not over yet." She held his gaze. "It's not even close to over." The problem with Crady resolved itself in a way she hadn't anticipated, and which she decided afterward was probably better than the confrontation she'd been preparing for. She found the note herself, by accident, on a Tuesday morning when she went into the barn to check on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg. The note was wedged into a gap in the wood of the stall partition, the kind of gap a person would know about only if they'd used it before, which meant Crady had either put it there or was meant to retrieve it. It was a folded piece of paper, and she stood in the cold barn for a moment with the mare nosing at her shoulder and debated exactly how long she was willing to remain the kind of person who didn't read other people's correspondence. She read it in about 4 seconds. It was short. A list, in handwriting she didn't recognize, pasture acreages, estimated cattle count, notation of the Murphy lease arrangement, information about the ranch's current state, information that had no reason to be written down and handed to anyone unless someone was building a case for a property valuation, or confirming that Blackthorn Ridge was still worth acquiring. She put the note back exactly where she'd found it. Then she went and found Deke. "I need you to do something, and I need you to not ask me why yet," she said. Deke looked at her steadily. He'd stopped asking why some time ago. "All right. I need Crady sent on an errand to town, something that'll take him most of the day. A legitimate errand. Supplies, mail, whatever you can arrange that makes sense. And while he's gone, I need to look at his things." There was a pause. "That's a serious thing," Deke said. "I know. I found a note in the barn. I want to see if there are others." Deke chewed on this for a moment. "If he's sending information to Brant, then we need to know what they know. And we need to decide what to do about it before they realize we know." Deke sent Crady to town the next morning with a list of supplies and a reason that was plausible enough not to raise questions. Madeline went through the bunkhouse with methodical speed and without touching anything that didn't need to be touched. She wasn't looking for a diary or a confession. She was looking for correspondence, for records of what had been passed and when. She found a second note, already used, folded small, with the marks of having been unfolded and refolded many times. Same handwriting as the first. It listed dates and observations. Water trough situation north pasture resolved. New woman moving suppliers. Cole meeting with trust rep. And at the bottom, in a different hand, just 3 words. "Keep watching. Report." She put it back. She went out of the bunkhouse and stood in the cold yard for a moment and thought about what to do with this. She could fire Crady. Cole would back her. But firing him solved only the immediate problem. It didn't change what Brant and Foss already knew, and it told them that Madeline had found their man, which would prompt them to move faster and more carefully. Or she could leave Crady in place and decide what information she wanted them to have. She was still thinking about it when she heard the wagon coming up the road from town, not Credy's return. It was too early. And looked up to see a wagon she didn't recognize with a woman driving it alone, sitting up straight, moving the horses at a practical pace that had nothing to do with hurry and everything to do with efficiency. The woman pulled up to the yard and looked down at Madeline from the wagon seat, and Madeline looked up at her, and for a moment they simply took each other's measure the way competent people do when they meet for the first time, and both of them can tell immediately that the other is not going to waste their time. "You're Madeline Whitaker," the woman said. "I am, and you're Iris Calloway." Iris climbed down from the wagon. She was 53 and built like someone who had spent her life doing physical work and had never stopped, with gray threaded through dark hair and a face that had been weathered by weather rather than by hardship. There was a difference, and Madeline had learned to read it. She wore practical clothes and good boots, and she had the handshake of a woman who'd been using handshakes to communicate things words couldn't carry for 30 years. "I got your last letter," Iris said. "And then I thought, it's faster to just come." "It's 40 miles, Madeline said. "I'm aware of how far it is. I drove it." She looked around the yard with a rancher's reflexive assessment, taking in the barn, the fence lines, the condition of what she could see. Place looks better than I expected from what you wrote. It's better than it was. It's not good yet. No, but better is a direction. Iris turned back to her. Tell me about the geological survey. The full thing, not the letter version, Madeline told her. They stood in the yard in the cold and she laid out everything she had. The survey, the holding company, Foss's name in the founding documents, the timing of the trust loan, the pattern of deliberate pressure applied across the past 2 years. She was thorough and she was precise, and Iris listened without interrupting, which was the quality she'd liked most in the letters and liked more in person. When Madeline finished, Iris said, 2 of the names I gave you in my letter, Nathan Pruitt and Vera Sohn. They've had survey work on adjacent land too. I didn't know until after I wrote to you, and then I asked around. Madeline went very still. The same holding company? I don't know. I don't know how to look that up. I do, Madeline said. Can you get me the parcel numbers on the adjacent surveys? Already wrote them down, Iris said, and pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket with the air of someone who had anticipated being asked. Cole came in from the south pasture an hour later to find 2 women at his kitchen table with the account books and the notebook and a spread of papers that covered every available surface, talking in the focused shorthand of people who have already agreed on the important things and are now working out the details. He stopped in the doorway. Cole Whitaker, Madeline said without looking up. This is Iris Calloway. She drove 40 miles this morning. I can see that, Cole said. He looked at Iris with the careful evaluation he gave to everything new. You're one of the ranchers Madeline wrote to. She wrote to 6 of us, Iris said. I'm the one who decided letters were taking too long. Cole came in and pulled up a chair and sat down and didn't say anything about the papers covering his kitchen table. He looked at Madeline. What did you find? Iris has 2 more properties with adjacent survey work. I'm going to the county seat tomorrow to pull those records and see if the same holding company shows up. She met his eyes. If it does, this is bigger than Blackthorn Ridge. This is a coordinated scheme across multiple ranches. Which means, Cole said slowly, it's not just a civil matter. No, Madeline said. It's fraud, possibly conspiracy to commit fraud. Iris folded her hands on the table. And it means there might be a way to go to the county land authority with enough evidence that they can't ignore it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Madeline knew what he was thinking, that this was a long road, and they had 31 days, and a fraud investigation ran on its own schedule with no regard for loan due dates. The trust loan, he said. I know, Madeline said. Even if we prove everything, it doesn't make the loan go away. No, she agreed. But it might make the right people very interested in how that loan came to exist, especially if the trust's been working as a mechanism in a coordinated land fraud scheme. She paused. A bank that's been implicated in fraud has strong motivation to cooperate with investigators, including renegotiating loan terms that might otherwise look like evidence. Iris looked at her. You've thought this through. I've had a month, Madeline said. She went to the county seat the next day and the day after that, and what she found on those 2 trips rearranged the scale of everything she'd been building. The adjacent surveys on Pruitt's land and Sowan's land had been commissioned by subsidiary companies, different names, different structures. But when she traced the founding documents carefully, both subsidiaries shared a registered agent with Foss's holding company. It was the corporate equivalent of a signature hidden under a false name, and it required patience and a willingness to treat dry legal documents like a puzzle rather than a chore. Madeline had both. By the time she drove home on the second evening, linking Ryland Foss to coordinated survey and acquisition activity on land adjacent to at least 4 ranches, all of which had experienced unusual supplier and financial difficulties in the preceding 2 years, and all of which had received purchase offers from parties connected to Gerald Brandt. She spread it all on the kitchen table that night, and she and Cole and Iris, who had stayed 2 days because there was work to do, and she was practical about things like that, went through it together piece by piece. It's enough, Iris said finally. I think it's enough to take to the county land authority. It might be enough to take further than that, Cole said. He'd been quiet through much of the review, which she'd learned meant he was doing serious thinking. The trust is out of Kansas City. If there's fraud in how that loan was structured, that's federal jurisdiction potentially. Railroad fraud offices have been interested in land schemes in this territory. Madeline looked at him. You know about that? My father dealt with a smaller version of this years ago, on the other side of it. He didn't like what he saw. Something crossed his face that was hard to read. Old history, complicated. I know what the process looks like. Then you know it takes time. Yes, he met her eyes. But I also know that the process, once started, tends to freeze things. If we can demonstrate ongoing fraud to the right office, they can issue a hold on asset transfers while the investigation is active. He paused. That stops a foreclosure sale. The room was very quiet for a moment. Madeline sat with that and let it settle into everything she'd been building and felt the shape of it change, from a defensive action against a deadline into something that might actually reach the source. Who do we go to? She said. There's a federal land office representative in the Capitol, Cole said. I know a man who knows how to reach him, a lawyer named Hartwell, who practiced in this territory for 20 years before he retired. He knows where everybody is buried, figuratively speaking, and he still has connections. How well do you know him? Iris asked. Well enough to ask for a meeting. Then ask, Madeline said. What she didn't say, because saying it would have made it too real in a way she wasn't ready for, was that this was the part she was most afraid of. Not the documents, not the evidence, not even the deadline. It was this part, the part where you take what you've built in private and put it in front of someone with power and ask them to believe you and wait to see whether they do. A woman with no official standing, a ranch wife, the bride. Everyone in Harrow Bend had watched, walk into a courthouse 6 weeks ago and assumed would be manageable. She'd spent her entire life being looked past by people who assumed that what they saw was everything there was to see. She knew what it cost to be taken seriously, and she knew it was never guaranteed, but she also knew what she had in that notebook, and she trusted it. Creddy left on his own 3 days later, which solved that problem in the most efficient way possible. Madeline came down in the morning, and Deke told her the man's bunk was cleared and his horse was gone, and the only thing left was the absence of him. She guessed he'd been recalled, that Brandt or Foss had decided the intelligence gathering phase was over, that they had what they needed, and that having a man on the property was now a liability more than an asset, which meant they were moving toward their endgame. She told Deke to find another hand, someone he personally vouched for. Anyone specific in mind? He asked. Someone whose family you know, she said. Someone with no particular connection to any of the larger spreads in the county. Deke found a man named Harlan, 26, nephew of a farmer he'd worked with 15 years ago. Harlan had a young wife and a practical attitude, and the kind of quietness that came from genuinely not having much to say, rather than from thinking something he wasn't showing. He was fine. The letter from Hartwell came on a Wednesday. Cole had written to him immediately, explained the situation in general terms, asked for a meeting. Hartwell's reply was short and characteristically direct. Come Thursday. Bring your documents. Bring the woman who found them. Cole read that last sentence aloud and looked at Madeline. He heard about you, he said. From who? I may have described the situation in a way that made your role clear, Cole said, in the careful voice of a man editing himself. He's old enough not to care about convention. He cares about competence. That's useful, she said. They drove to Hartwell's house on Thursday, which was 2 hours in the opposite direction from the county seat, up into a part of the territory that got serious about elevation and wind. Hartwell himself was 74 and had the body of a man who had been built large and then worn down to the essential, like a piece of furniture that had survived multiple generations. He had white eyebrows that expressed more than most men's faces and a habit of cutting directly to the point that Madeline found genuinely refreshing. He looked at her documents for 40 minutes without speaking. Cole sat in the corner of the study. Madeline sat across the desk from Hartwell and let him read. You traced the holding company through registered agents, Hartwell said finally, without looking up. Yes. Across 3 subsidiaries, yes. And you did this yourself in county land records offices? Yes. He looked up then, and his expression was that of a man who has been surprised at this point in his life less often than he would have preferred, and who therefore notes it when it happens. How old are you? 28. And your background? Farm accounts, she said, since I was 16. He looked at Cole briefly. Cole said nothing, which was, in this instance, exactly the right thing. Hartwell looked back at Madeline. What you have here is not proof of fraud. It is evidence consistent with fraud, which is a different thing. A court requires the former. I know, she said. I'm not asking for a conviction. I'm asking for enough to open an investigation that can freeze the asset transfer while the investigation is active. Which gives you what? 20 days? On the trust loan? 23. He folded his hands on the desk. The federal land office representative in the capital is a man named Crowell. I know him. He is cautious and methodical and does not like to be wrong, which means he is slow to act and also slow to be dislodged once he has acted. A pause. If I write him a letter and frame this properly, and if you go to him in person with what you have here, there is a reasonable chance he initiates a preliminary inquiry. And the inquiry? If he determines the evidence warrants it, he can issue a temporary hold on asset transfers related to properties under inquiry, which would include the Blackthorn Ridge foreclosure. The breath Madeline had been holding for 3 weeks shifted in her chest. Would he? He might. Hartwell picked up the papers again. I want to take these for 48 hours. I'll write my letter on Friday, and you can carry it to Crowell yourselves on Monday. We only have, I heard you, 23 days. He looked at her over the papers. Mrs. Whitaker, in 40 years of practice, I have seen this kind of scheme in 4 iterations across 2 territories, and it has always run on the same fuel. The assumption that nobody on the losing end is going to put together what you have put together. Foss and Brandt are operating on that assumption right now. They believe you're scrambling. A pause. Are you? No, she said. Good. Then stop counting days and trust the process. She thought about telling him that trusting the process was easier when you weren't the one who'd put your life into a piece of land and couldn't sleep properly for the sound of the clock running down. She decided not to, because Hartwell already knew that, and saying it wouldn't help anything. Thank you, she said instead. The drive back was quiet for the first half hour. The country rolled by in the gray afternoon light, and Cole drove, and Madeline sat with her hands in her lap and let the tension of the meeting work its way out of her slowly. He's going to write the letter, Cole said. Yes. Do you think Crowell will act? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything, without telling herself what she wanted to hear. I think we have the best chance we're going to get, she said. I think Hartwell wouldn't have agreed to write the letter if he thought it was hopeless. She looked out at the passing country. But I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Cole was quiet. Then, I owe you an accounting. Of what? Of what this has actually been like. From my side. His voice was careful, the way it was when he was saying something that cost him. When you first got here, I told myself you'd figure out within a week that the situation was impossible and that you'd go back to your family and I'd have to find another way. I didn't think you'd stay. I certainly didn't think you'd... He stopped. Do any of this? She offered. Yes, any of this. He kept his eyes on the road. And what I want to say is, I don't know if I've made it clear that I understand what you've done here. It's not just the contracts or the documents. It's that you could have decided this wasn't your problem. Nobody would have blamed you. It wasn't your debt. It was my life, she said simply. It became my life when I put that ring on. He glanced at her and then back at the road, and she thought there was something in his face that hadn't been there before, something she didn't have a name for but recognized, the way you recognize weather before it arrives by a change in the quality of the air. There's something else, he said. What? Brandt came to see me this morning, before we left. He said it without preamble, which was how he said things he'd been holding. He didn't come to the house. He found me in the north pasture. She turned to look at him. What did he say? He raised the offer. Cole's jaw was tight, significantly, and he said it wouldn't go higher, that if I didn't take it by end of week, the opportunity would be gone. He's feeling time pressure, she said immediately. If he's raising the offer and setting a deadline, he knows something's moving against him. Someone told him, she said, or he figured it out. We went to the county seat twice. We drove out to Hartwell. Someone saw us, or Creddy passed something before he left. She pressed her hand against the notebook in her coat pocket. He's trying to close before we can stop him. Yes. What did you tell him? Cole looked straight ahead at the road. I told him I needed to talk to my wife. The word landed differently than she expected, not as a formality or a courtesy, as something he meant. She looked at his profile in the flat afternoon light and felt something shift between them, some tectonic thing that had been moving slowly for weeks and had now moved enough to be felt. "We don't sell," she said. "No," he agreed. "We don't sell." When they got back to Blackthorn Ridge that evening, there was a letter waiting at the house, delivered while they'd been gone. Not from the trust. From Harrow Bend, no return address, the handwriting disguised in the blocky, over-careful way of someone who didn't want to be identified. Madeline read it in the kitchen doorway before she'd even taken off her coat. It said, "You should know that 2 men have been making inquiries in town about the Cross family debt. The original paperwork. Asking whether the marriage contract is legitimate under current law. Be careful." She stood very still. They weren't just trying to take the land. They were going to try to unwind the marriage. If the marriage contract was voided on any technicality, any obscure legal argument, then Madeline's standing as Cole's wife evaporated, and with it her ability to act on the ranch's behalf, to have negotiated those contracts, to have accessed those records. Every action she'd taken in 2 months of fighting could potentially be challenged. Foss, she realized, was not stupid. He had looked at the board and seen that the most efficient way to neutralize her was not to fight what she'd built, but to argue she'd never had the right to build it. She went inside. She put the letter on the table, she took off her coat, and hung it up and came back and stood looking at it. Cole came in behind her and saw her face, and then saw the letter. He read it. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight. "Can they do that?" Madeline said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. "I don't know," Cole said. "I need to think about whether there's any ground to stand on." A pause. "The contract was my father's, not mine, and it's an old form. There might be arguments about its enforceability. If the marriage is challenged, I know," he said. "Everything I've done, all the supplier negotiations, the access to the county records as your wife. It could all be Madeline." He said her name in a way he hadn't said it before. Direct, certain, cutting through. "Listen to me. Whatever they do with the contract, whatever argument they make, I am not going to let this marriage be undone." He held her gaze, and there was no ambiguity in it, no carefully managed distance. "Not because of the ranch, because I don't want it undone." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was cold and the lamp was the only light, and outside the wind was working at the eaves of the house, the way winter wind does when it's made up its mind. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She picked up the anonymous letter and put it with the notebook and the rest of the documents, because even threats were evidence, and she had learned by now to treat everything as evidence. Then she sat down and pulled the notebook toward her and opened it to the next clean page. They had 23 days. Hartwell was writing a letter. Crowell was in the capital. Iris Calloway was 40 miles north with 4 more names. And somewhere in Harrow Bend, 2 men were asking questions about a marriage contract on behalf of someone who had just told her, by doing exactly that he was scared. Scared meant she was close enough to matter. She wrote the date at the top of the page and underlined it. Then she started working out what the next 23 days had to look like, hour by hour, because that was the only way she knew how to do anything. Not by hoping the road would clear, but by figuring out exactly which stones needed to be moved and in what order and with whose help and on what timeline, until the way through was not a hope, but a plan. The lamp burned low. Cole made coffee that was too strong and put a cup in front of her without being asked. She drank it without looking up from the notebook. Outside, the dark land of Blackthorn Ridge sat under a winter sky that didn't care about any of it. Not the fraud, or the loan, or the anonymous letters, or the 2 people inside the house trying to hold what they'd built together. The land was just land. It didn't ask for heroes or demand that things be fair, but it was hers. It was theirs. And she was not done. Hartwell's letter arrived on Friday, as promised, delivered by a rider who handed it to Cole at the gate and left without waiting for a response. It was sealed with wax and addressed to James Crowell, Federal Land Office representative, in Hartwell's small, precise hand. He had included a note for Madeline separately. 3 sentences, no salutation. The letter makes the case as strongly as the evidence allows. Crowell will read it before you arrive if you send it ahead by post rider today. Do not go to him without an appointment. He dislikes surprises. She sent it ahead that afternoon. Then she sat down and wrote to Iris Calloway and told her to expect a letter from the Federal Land Office within the week asking about her property's adjacent surveys. She wrote to Nathan Pruitt and Vera Sohn with the same information. She wrote carefully and she wrote fast because they had 19 days now and the capital was a full day's ride. Cole arranged for them to leave Monday morning. He told Deke he'd be gone 2 days, possibly 3, and Deke received this information with the particular stillness of a man who understood more than he was being told and had decided to be reliable about it. "The ranch will be here when you get back," Deke said. "I know it will," Cole said, "because you'll be here." Deke looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, and that was that. The night before they left, Madeline sat at the kitchen table and went through the documents one final time. She had organized them into a sequence, not chronological but argumentative, the way a lawyer builds a case, each piece leading to the next so that the pattern emerged gradually, and then, at the end, undeniably. She had written a summary page in her clearest hand. She had made a duplicate of everything and left it with Iris because she had learned that important things needed to exist in more than one place. Cole came and sat across from her at some point and watched her work without speaking, and she didn't mind it. His presence had become something she was used to in a way she hadn't expected. Not intrusive, not demanding, just there. The way a good fence is there. Functional and reliable and easy to forget until you need it. "Are you ready?" he said when she finally closed the folder. "I'm ready," she said. "Whether Crowell is ready for us is a different question." He almost smiled again. She was getting better at catching those. The capital was larger than Harrow Bend in the way that administrative cities are large, not from commerce or community, but from the accumulation of official functions, each requiring a building and a staff and a set of procedures. The Federal Land Office was on the second floor of a building that smelled of paper and coal heat, and James Crowell kept them waiting for 45 minutes in an anteroom before his door opened. Crowell was 61 and looked like a man who had spent his career being asked to make decisions he couldn't fully verify and had developed a constitutional caution as a result. He was not unfriendly. He was not warm either. He was the kind of official who treated every person who came into his office as a potential problem until proven otherwise, which Madeline thought was actually a reasonable policy for someone in his position. He had read Hartwell's letter. She could tell because he looked at her when they came in with the specific quality of attention of someone who has been told to expect something and is now checking expectations against reality. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Whitaker." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk and sat down himself. "I've read Oliver Hartwell's letter. He is not a man who writes letters lightly, which is why you're sitting here rather than downstairs with one of my clerks." He folded his hands. "Show me what you have." She showed him. She laid it out in the order she'd organized it the night before. The supply contract manipulation first, then the trust loan and Foss's connection to it, then the geological surveys and the holding companies, then the subsidiary connections across 3 properties. She spoke while he read, filling in context without over-explaining, reading when he needed to read and stopping when he needed to think. He asked 3 questions during the presentation. All 3 were precise and targeted at the weakest links in her chain of evidence. She had anticipated 2 of them. The third she answered honestly. "That connection I can suggest, but I can't document yet. It's inferred from timing." He looked up at that. "You're telling me where your evidence is thin?" "Yes." "Most people presenting a case don't do that." "Most people haven't read your letter from Hartwell," she said. "I assume he told you to expect straight dealing." Something moved at the corner of Crowell's mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that general territory. He looked back at the documents. He read for another long time. When he looked up again, his expression had changed in a small but legible way, from the professional neutrality of intake to something more considered. "The subsidiary registered agent connection across 3 holding companies," he said. "You found this in Standard County land records?" "Yes." "Over how many visits?" 4 2 counties. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be direct with you about what I can and cannot do. A preliminary inquiry can be initiated on the basis of evidence consistent with fraud, which is what you have. Once initiated, I can issue a hold-on asset transfers involving properties under inquiry, which includes any foreclosure sale proceeding on a property that may be implicated." He paused. "That hold would apply to Blackthorn Ridge." Madeline kept her face still. How long does initiation take? If I determine the evidence warrants it, I can issue the preliminary finding within 72 hours. We have 19 days on the trust loan. I'm aware. He gathered the documents into the folder she'd brought them in. I'll need to retain these for review. Do you have copies? Yes. Hartwell trained you well. Hartwell didn't train me. He just confirmed what I'd already put together. Crowell looked at her for a long moment. Not appraising exactly, more the look of someone filing something away for future reference. I'll be in contact within the week, he said. One way or another. They drove back from the capital in the gray afternoon with the cold coming in from the north, and Madeline sat for a long time without speaking and let the tension of the past 3 hours work its way out through her hands, which were clasped in her lap and were, now that nobody needed to see them be steady, trembling slightly. Cole noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He said, "That went better than it could have. We won't know for a week." Still, she looked out at the plains spreading wide on both sides of the road, the winter-pale grass running to the horizon. He took the documents. Yes. He asked the right questions. He did. I think he's going to act. She said it quietly, not as a declaration but as an assessment. The way she'd say, I think the frost is going to hold, or I think the east pasture needs another week, measured and careful, and not more certain than she had right to be. I think he's been looking for something like this and we've handed him the shape of it. And if he doesn't? Then we figure out what's next, she said. Same as always. Cole turned to look at her briefly, then back at the road. You know, he said, when I was a boy, my father used to say that the land is the only honest thing, that people lie and weather lies and prices lie, but the land is what it is and always will be what it is. He paused. I believed that for a long time. And now? Now I think he had it backwards. The land doesn't care. It's not honest. It's just indifferent. He was quiet a moment. The honest thing, it turns out, is the person who looks at what's actually there instead of what they want to see. She looked at him. He was watching the road, his profile against the gray sky, and he looked tired in the honest way of people who've been carrying weight for a long time and know they're not done yet. That might be the nicest thing you've said to me, she said. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation. She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, coming out full and unguarded in the cold air of the wagon. It surprised him too, she thought, from the way he looked at her, like something he hadn't heard in a while and had stopped expecting. 3 days after they returned from the capital, Gerald Brandt made his next move. It didn't come to the ranch this time. It came to the town. Madeline was at the general store on a Thursday morning when she first understood what was happening. She'd come for lamp oil and coffee and a length of rope for a fence repair, and the store was busy enough that she had to wait. And while she waited, she heard the conversation at the counter change when she walked in, not the usual lowering of voices that she'd grown accustomed to, but something different. A specific quality of discomfort, the kind that comes when people have been talking about someone and that someone has just arrived. She bought her things and left, and outside she found Tom Murphy loading his wagon 3 spaces down, and she went to him directly because Tom was a straight dealer and she trusted him. What are people saying? She said. Tom looked uncomfortable. He had the face of a man who didn't like carrying bad news and was about to do it anyway. There's a story going around that the marriage contract, yours and Cole's, might not be legal, that it was written under terms that aren't enforceable under current territorial law. Who's saying that? It's being said. I don't know who started it. He looked at her steadily. People are also saying that if the marriage is invalid, then everything you've done at the ranch, the supplier contracts, the lease you arranged with me, might be void, that Cole could be held liable for misrepresentation. She kept her face still. The air was cold and the main street of Harrow Bend ran out in both directions and people moved along it, doing ordinary things in ordinary ways while this was happening, and it had a particular quality of absurdity to it, the way threats always do when they arrive in the middle of an ordinary day. Tom, she said, is our lease going to be a problem for you? No, he said immediately. The lease is the lease. I'm not tearing it up over gossip. He paused. But Madeline, some people are. Halverson is talking about revisiting the contract renegotiation, saying he agreed to new terms under false pretenses. Halverson. Of course. The man who'd been overcharging them for 2 years was now claiming victimhood and having to stop. Thank you, she said, for telling me directly. She drove back to Blackthorn Ridge and went to Cole and told him what Tom had said, and Cole listened with his jaw set and his eyes doing that calculation she recognized now as him thinking through a problem from multiple angles before he picked one. Halverson's bluffing, he said. He'd be opening himself up to examination of his own billing records if he goes to court over that contract. He might not know that, Madeline said. He might be operating on instruction from Brant without understanding the full picture. Or he does know, and he's counting on us not wanting to fight on two fronts. She sat down at the table. She was tired in a way she'd been managing for weeks. Not the physical tired of ranch work, but the sustained mental tired of fighting on multiple surfaces simultaneously. And she was careful with it, the way you're careful with a resource you can't replenish easily. We need to address the marriage contract question directly, not defensively, directly. How? We need a lawyer to produce a formal opinion on its validity, something on record, something that can be pointed to. She looked at him. Hartwell. He doesn't practice anymore. He doesn't have to practice. He just has to write a legal opinion. I'll ask. She wrote to Hartwell that evening. She also wrote a longer letter to Iris, detailing what was happening in town, because she had an instinct that what was happening in Harrow Bend was not isolated, that if Brant was running this across multiple properties, the public reputation campaign might be happening in multiple places simultaneously, designed to isolate each victim and make them feel they were fighting alone. Iris's reply came faster than the mail should have allowed, which meant she'd already been dealing with it. Same story in my county. Someone saying I don't have legal standing on the lease I've held for 8 years. It started 3 days ago. And then, in the flat declarative style that Madeline had come to appreciate deeply, I think we need to be in the same room, all of us. She was right. Madeline knew it as soon as she read it. She spent the next day writing to every rancher who'd been in correspondence with her, Pruitt, so on, and 2 others whose situations she'd been tracking, and proposing a meeting, not at any of their properties. On neutral ground, a town midway between the spread of their ranches, a place called Caswell that had a feed hall large enough for people to sit in a circle and talk. She framed the invitation carefully. She didn't use the word coalition or organize or alliance because those words made people's backs go up, especially people who had built their lives on independence. She used the word conversation, a chance to share what they'd each found, to see whether the shape of it looked the same from their side as it did from hers. 5 out of 6 wrote back. All 5 said yes. Cole read the replies over her shoulder at the kitchen table. You're building something, he said. I'm building the thing that should have existed before any of this started, she said. A way for ranchers in this territory to actually talk to each other. She looked at the replies spread across the table. Foss and Brant counted on everyone being isolated. They targeted one at a time. They moved in after droughts and fires and bad seasons when people were already beaten down and trying to keep their heads up individually. She looked at him. What if we'd all been talking to each other 3 years ago? Would any of this have gotten as far as it did? Cole was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Probably not. Then that's what we build. Hartwell's opinion on the marriage contract arrived 4 days later and was, as everything Hartwell produced was, precise and entirely without sentiment. The contract, he wrote, was unusual in form but not invalid in substance under either territorial or federal statute. Its enforceability had not been legally challenged, and there was no credible basis for challenge given that both parties had entered into it knowingly and the terms had been fulfilled. He included 3 case citations. He offered to provide supplementary documentation if needed. She had it notarized in Harrow Bend the same day it arrived. Then she made copies and sent one to Cole's lawyer in the county seat with instructions to file it in the property record. She also let it be known, not by announcing it, but by leaving a copy with the postmaster and mentioning it in conversation to Tom Murphy and Bess, that the opinion existed. Within 3 days, the gossip in Harrow Bend shifted. Not dramatically, not immediately, but in the way of water finding a new channel. The story about the invalid contract lost its confidence. People who had been repeating it started hedging. Well, I heard there's a legal opinion that says differently. The story didn't die, but it got uncertain, and an uncertain story is a story that's losing. Halverson did not pursue the contract challenge. She'd expected he wouldn't. What she hadn't expected was Walt. On a cold morning in the second week of that stretch, Walt came to her. Not to Cole, not to Deke, to her. He came to the house while she was going through the morning accounts and knocked at the back door with his hat in his hands. And when she opened it, he looked like a man who had been rehearsing something and was now not entirely sure he remembered the words. "I have something to say," he said. "Come in," she said. She poured coffee without asking whether he wanted it because this seemed like a situation that required something to do with your hands. He sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't drink it. "I was wrong about you," he said. It came out with the specific effort of a man who doesn't say this kind of thing and knows it. "All right," she said. "I made it harder for you than it needed to be when you first came. And I want to say I'm sorry for that." She looked at him, 50-some years old, weathered, proud, sitting in her kitchen with his hat in his lap doing something that clearly cost him more than most things did. "What changed?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Creddy," he said. "When he left like that, I started thinking about what that meant, what he was doing here. And I thought about all the things I'd told him, not important things, but things a person tells when they're talking about work, about the ranch." His jaw worked. "If any of that got used to hurt this place, that's partly on me." "You didn't know?" "No, but I should have paid more attention." He looked at the coffee cup. "You did pay attention. You figured it out, and you handled it quiet without making it a whole thing." He glanced up. "I've been watching how you work. I've been watching for a while. And I want you to know that whatever you need from me, I'll do it." Madeline held his gaze and thought about what to say. The clean version would be, "I appreciate that, thank you." The honest version was something with more texture. "Walt," she said, "you didn't have to come in here and say that. It would have been easier not to." "Yeah. So I'll tell you this. I need people who see what's actually in front of them and not what they expected to see. I need that more than I need people who agree with me." She met his eyes. "So if you ever think I'm wrong about something, I want to hear it." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded once, put on his hat, picked up the coffee cup and finally drank from it. "That north fence line," he said. "Third post in from the creek. It's been leaning since October and nobody's fixed it." "Then fix it today," she said. He almost smiled. It was a different almost smile than Cole's. A rougher one, less practiced. But it was in the same family. The meeting in Caswell happened on a Thursday in the third week of December, with snow threatening from the north and all 5 ranchers arriving within an hour of each other, which under the circumstances Madeline thought was practically miraculous. Iris came first, practical and unhurried. Pruitt was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who looked like he'd spent the drive rehearsing his skepticism and arrived slightly disarmed by the fact that there were other people in the room. Vera Sohn was 61 and talked fast and had done her own research since Madeline's letter, and came in with her own folder of documents, which made Madeline feel something between relief and deep affection. The other two, a man named Gideon Park and a younger rancher named Francis Albee, who ran her late husband's operation, were quieter but present, listening with the particular attention of people who have been told something important and are checking it against their own experience. Cole sat slightly apart from the main table, not because he was excluded, but because he'd asked to listen rather than lead, which Madeline had noted without comment and appreciated deeply. She laid out the full picture. Everything. Not just the Blackthorn Ridge situation, but the pattern across all their properties, the shared subsidiaries, the coordinated timing, the federal inquiry she and Cole had initiated, and the preliminary findings she was still waiting on. She was thorough, and she was plain, and she did not overstate what she knew. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Vera Sohn put her folder on the table and opened it. "I found something in my county's records last week," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it. I do now." She pushed the papers toward the center of the table. "The survey company, the one that did the adjacent assessment on my northeast boundary. I traced it to a parent company out of Kansas City." "The same registered agent?" Madeline asked. "No, different one, but the parent company has a board of directors on file." Vera paused. "Gerald Brandt is listed as a board member." The room changed. Not loudly. There were no dramatic reactions, because these were people who had learned to keep their reactions measured, but the air in it shifted as 6 people simultaneously recalibrated what they were dealing with. Brandt's name on the board of the parent company was not just a connection to Foss's holding company network. It was direct evidence, not inferred, not traced through registered agents. His name on a document, in his capacity, linking him to the acquisition scheme. Madeline looked at the papers Vera had pushed forward. She looked at them for a long moment. "May I copy these today?" "You can have the originals. I made 3 copies on the way here." Madeline thought, "I like this woman very much." She added Vera's documents to the folder going to Crowell. She wrote a supplementary letter to the Federal Land Office that evening from the room she and Cole had taken at Caswell's small hotel, adding the new evidence and its implications. She sent it by post rider the next morning, which was faster than waiting until they got back. 2 days after they returned to Blackthorn Ridge, Crowell's letter arrived. He had initiated the preliminary inquiry. The hold on asset transfers was in effect for all properties named in the inquiry, pending investigation. The Consolidated Cattle Trust of Kansas City had been contacted, and the foreclosure proceedings on Blackthorn Ridge were suspended pending inquiry resolution. She read it twice. Then she went and found Cole in the barn, where he was working on something structural she'd asked Deke to arrange weeks ago and which had been delayed by everything else, and she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically. Cole was not a man who showed relief the way other people did. But his shoulders did something. They dropped, fractionally, in the way of a man who has been holding a weight for long enough that he's forgotten what it felt like not to. "How long does the inquiry take?" he said. "Months, probably. Maybe longer." "But the foreclosure is suspended, yes." He handed the letter back. He looked at her for a long moment. "You did that." "We did that," she said. "Madeline." "Cole." He exhaled. It was not a speech. It was a single breath, the weight of a specific kind of relief compressed into an ordinary action, and it told her more than a speech would have. The problem was that Brandt still had his property, his connections, and his resources. And a man like that did not accept a federal inquiry as a conclusion. He accepted it as a complication. She knew that. She'd known it before the letter came, which was why she'd been building the other thing, the network, the coalition of ranchers, the collective shape of what they'd all been through, alongside the legal case. The inquiry froze the foreclosure, but it didn't expose the scheme to the public. And Brandt, as long as the scheme remained hidden, retained influence. He still had relationships in Harrow Bend. He still had the social power of a wealthy and long-established man in a community where such things mattered. The 2 men who'd been asking about the marriage contract were still, presumably, on his payroll. She went back to the notebook. The next piece was harder than the documents. Documents lived in records offices and had the virtue of existing whether or not anyone was watching them. What she needed now was testimony, people who had direct experience of what Brandt and Foss had done, who were willing to say so on record. That was different from evidence. Evidence could be compiled in private. Testimony required people to put themselves in front of a process and stand there. She wrote to the ranchers from the Caswell meeting. She was direct about what she was asking, whether any of them had had direct communication with Foss or Brandt regarding their properties, offers made, pressures applied, specific things said, that they were willing to provide to Crowell's office as a statement. She expected hesitation. She got less of it than she'd anticipated. Pruitt wrote back that Foss had personally visited his ranch 2 years ago and made statements about adjacent land value that, in retrospect, had been part of the setup. He was willing to sign a statement. Vera Swan had a letter from Brandt offering to buy her property, signed and dated from 14 months ago. She'd kept it in a drawer because she never threw anything away. She was willing to provide it. Iris sent a statement already written. 3 pages. Detailed, precise, and devastating in the way of calm, factual accounts of deliberate harm. She'd clearly been waiting for somewhere to send it. Madeline compiled everything and sent a new packet to Crowell's office with a cover letter that was the most careful thing she'd ever written. Organized, precise, with each piece of evidence keyed to the relevant element of the inquiry. She spent 2 evenings on it. Cole read it when she was done and said, "I don't have anything to add to that." "Good," she said. "That's what I was going for." The reaction from Brandt's direction came in a form she'd expected and had prepared for, but that still landed hard when it arrived. It came through Harrow Bend's social machinery, not a legal challenge this time, but a personal one. a story that began circulating about the Cross family, about Hector Cross's debt, and what it said about the family's character, about Madeline specifically, about whether a woman from that background had any business making decisions that affected the larger community. It was old and low and effective, in the way of attacks on character that can't be disproven because they don't make specific claims, just implications. She heard it through Bess Murphy, who came to the ranch specifically to tell her, with the particular manner of a woman delivering bad news to someone she'd decided she liked. "People are saying it," Bess said. "I want you to know that Tom and I aren't among them, but it's being said." "I know," Madeline said. "Thank you for coming to tell me directly." After Bess left, she sat for a while with it. She was not naive enough to be surprised. She was not thick-skinned enough to be entirely unaffected. There was a particular hurt in having the thing you couldn't control, your family, where you came from, what your father owed, used as the weapon of last resort. It found the places in her that were still soft, still carrying the weight of the courthouse and the ring hitting the table and every conversation in Harrow Bend that had gone quiet when she walked in. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to walk from the house to the barn and back. Then she sat down and thought about what to do about it, because that was the only useful thing left. The answer, she decided, was not to defend herself. Defense was reactive, and it put her on the wrong side of the argument. Instead, she went to town the following Thursday, her regular supply run, no special occasion, and she did what she'd been doing every week. She bought her things, and she paid her accounts, and she spoke to people directly and without apology. She did not address the gossip. She did not explain herself or her family or her marriage. She just kept showing up, steady and unashamed, and let the contrast do the work. It was slow. It was not satisfying in the immediate way that confrontation is satisfying. But she had learned in the months since arriving at Blackthorn Ridge that the things that worked slowly were often the ones that held. Deke told her 2 weeks later, without editorial comment, that he'd overheard 2 men at the feed store, men who'd been among the louder voices about her in the early months, talking about the Whitaker operation's improved numbers, the way the East pasture had come back, the early cattle sale, and the Murphy lease. Talking about it in the tone of people who are noting something unexpected and haven't quite decided how to adjust their opinion, but are in the process. "That's something," Deke said. "It's a start," she said. She didn't tell him what she knew, which was that a start was sometimes all you needed, that if you built the foundation right and kept building, the structure eventually spoke for itself. The letter from Crowell's office came on a gray Monday afternoon, and it did not give her everything she'd asked for, but it gave her more than she'd let herself expect. The inquiry had expanded. Based on the testimony and supplementary evidence provided by 5 ranchers, the investigation now encompassed multiple properties and multiple parties. Ryland Foss had been formally notified of his status as a subject of the inquiry. Gerald Brandt had been contacted for an interview. The Blackthorn Ridge foreclosure hold was extended indefinitely pending resolution. She read it sitting at the kitchen table with the winter light coming in flat and gray through the windows that were no longer boarded up, that she'd had reglazed in November with the money from the Murphy lease. Cole was out on the property somewhere. Deke was working. Harlan was fixing the north fence line that Walt had identified. The ranch was running. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but running, with the particular unglamorous momentum of an operation that has found its footing and is learning how to keep it. She put the letter down and looked at the kitchen, at the table where she'd spent so many evenings with the account books and the notebook, at the window with the new glass, at the coffee cups that were both hers now, in the way that things become yours through use and time. She was 28 years old. She had come here with 1 bag and a ring that had been thrown onto a table in a community full of people who had already decided she was going to fail. She had built something in 6 months that she hadn't been able to name when she started it, because she hadn't known yet what it would become. She picked up the letter and went to find Cole. She found Cole at the north fence line, standing beside Harlan and Walt, looking at the post that had been leaning since October and was now straight and solid in the frozen ground. The 3 of them were not talking, just looking at the fixed fence the way men look at work they've completed, with the quiet satisfaction of people who deal in physical problems and physical solutions. She walked up and handed Cole the letter without preamble. He read it with his hands in his coat and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Walt and Harlan stepped away without being asked, giving him the space, and she watched his face while he read. and saw the same thing she'd seen when the first Crowell letter came, that small structural change in the shoulders, the weight adjusting. He looked up. Brant's being interviewed. Yes. And Foss is formally under inquiry. Yes. He folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then he handed it back and looked at the fence post, straight and solid in the ground, and then out across the property. The winter pale pasture, the barn with its repaired roof, the fence lines running clean to the horizon. You know what's strange, he said. This morning I was thinking about the east pasture rotation, just thinking about what it would look like in spring, what kind of growth we'd get if we kept the current schedule. He paused. I haven't thought that far ahead since before my father died. She stood beside him and looked at the same horizon. The sky was the particular low gray of a winter afternoon that hasn't decided whether to snow or just threaten, and the land was quiet in the way it only is when the wind takes a breath between efforts. That's a good sign, she said. I thought so too. They stood there for a moment longer, the two of them, in the cold quiet of Blackthorn Ridge in December. And it was not a dramatic moment. It did not feel like a turning point from the inside, which is how most turning points feel, only recognizable as such when you look back at them from some distance. At the time, it felt like two tired people standing in a field after a long run of hard days, looking at a fence post in a winter sky, and something that might, with continued work and continued luck, be a future. The inquiry moved this way Crowell had predicted it would, on its own schedule, with its own rhythms, largely invisible to the people it most affected. January came and went, and then February, and the ranch ran through winter on the revised operations Madeline had put in place, which were not elegant but were functional, which she had decided was the honest version of success. The Murphy lease held. The supplier contracts held. The cattle wintered better than they had the previous year, which Deke told her with the understated satisfaction of a man who had watched many winters and knew how to read the difference. She heard things from town through the usual channels, through Bess Murphy, through the postmaster who had a way of conveying information through what he said and what he chose not to say, through the occasional direct visit from someone who had shifted from observer to something more like neighbor. The inquiry had become, in the way of things in a small community, a known fact whose details were imprecise but whose general shape everyone had formed an opinion about. Brant had been seen leaving Harrow Bend for the capital twice. Foss had not been seen at all since November, which was notable because before that he'd been a regular presence in town. The gossip about Madeline's family, about the marriage contract, about whether she had any right to have done what she'd done, that ran out of steam slowly, the way fire runs out when there's nothing left to feed it. Nobody announced that they'd changed their minds. People rarely do. They just stop saying the thing they were saying and start saying something different, and if you're patient enough to wait for it, you eventually notice the silence where the old story used to be. She was patient. She had always been patient. In March, Crowell's office sent a formal communication addressed to both her and Cole, which she read 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly, and then read a 4th time to be sure. The inquiry had produced sufficient evidence for a formal fraud referral to the federal prosecutor's office covering the territory. Ryland Foss and Gerald Brant were the named subjects. The scheme had been documented across 6 properties, including Blackthorn Ridge, with evidence of coordinated supplier interference, predatory loan steering, and deliberate acquisition of mineral rights under false pretenses. The consolidated mineral survey data, across all 6 adjacent properties, indicated coal deposits of significant commercial value, which provided the underlying motive for the entire operation. The Consolidated Cattle Trust of Kansas City had cooperated fully with investigators, providing documentation that confirmed Foss had provided the trust with assurances of acquisition that had formed the basis for the loan's terms. The trust, in exchange for its cooperation, had agreed to renegotiate all outstanding loans on properties affected by the scheme. Blackthorn Ridge's loan had been restructured to a 7-year repayment at revised terms, effective immediately. The foreclosure was dismissed, permanently. She put the letter on the table and sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain under her palms, the slight roughness of a table that had been used for years and had the evidence of that use in its surface. She thought about the night she'd arrived, the ring spinning on this table, the cold house, the closed expression on the face of the man she'd just married, the weight of what she was walking into, and how much she hadn't known yet. She had not cried then. She did not cry now. but she allowed herself, for one quiet minute in the empty kitchen, to simply be in the full reality of what she'd built, without qualifying it, or looking ahead to the next problem, or thinking about what still needed to be done. 1 minute. Then she went to find Cole. He was in the barn. He was always in the barn when he needed to think, which she'd figured out by early November, the same way she'd figured out the window and the jaw and the way he handed things back when he was done processing them. She had been learning his language for months the way you learn a terrain, by walking it repeatedly until you know where the ground is reliable and where it shifts. She told him what the letter said, all of it, in order, plainly. He listened the way he listened now, fully, without looking away, without the reflex to redirect or assert something before she'd finished. When she was done, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "The trust cooperated." "Yes." Voss gave them assurances he had no right to give, and they took them because it served their interests, and now they're cooperating because it serves their interests. A pause. "That's honest, at least. They're not pretending to be sorry." "No," she agreed. "They're not." He was quiet again. 7 years, on the loan. At revised terms. I did the arithmetic this morning. If the cattle operation holds the trajectory it's on, and we expand the herd in spring the way Deke's been suggesting, we can be ahead of schedule by year 3. He looked at her. "You've already done the arithmetic." "I've been doing it since February," she said. "I needed something to do while I was waiting." He looked away and then back. "What do we do about Brandt's land?" "That's for the courts and the federal prosecutor. That's not ours to handle." "His operation is adjacent to ours. When it goes through the process, it'll be a long process," she said, "and the land will end up wherever it ends up. We don't need it. We have enough." She met his eyes. "We have what we need." Cole looked at her for a long moment. That direct, considering, specific look that she had come to understand was the highest register of attention he possessed. He used it rarely and meant it fully. "Yes," he said, "we do." What happened next in Harrow Bend happened the way things happen in small communities when the story they've been telling turns out to have been wrong. Not in a single dramatic reversal, but in a gradual, unglamorous shift, each person adjusting individually and in private, so that the collective adjustment is only visible in retrospect. The fraud case was public knowledge by April, when the prosecutor's office issued its first formal notices, and the regional newspaper ran a piece that was factually thin but directionally accurate. By May, most people in Harrow Bend understood in general terms what Brandt and Foss had been doing, and understood also that the woman they'd been watching fail since October of the previous year had been, instead, the person most responsible for stopping it. This did not produce immediate celebration. People who have misjudged someone significantly tend not to celebrate the discovery. They tend toward a kind of quiet recalibration, a reorganization of how they remember the sequence of events, and a pronounced reluctance to discuss it directly. Madeline had expected this and was not bothered by it. She had not been fighting for their admiration. She had been fighting for the ranch, and for the pattern to be broken, and for the people who had been quietly losing to have somewhere to put what they'd found. What she had not expected was Halverson. He came to the ranch in late April with his hat and his discomfort, and a face that looked like it had been having the same argument with itself for several weeks, and had finally reached a resolution. He asked to speak to Cole and Madeline together, which told her something. They sat at the kitchen table, which was where everything happened, the table that had been the first sight of her marriage and the workspace of her investigation and the location of every important conversation she'd had in the past 7 months. Halverson put an envelope on the table. Inside was a bank draft. 18 months of overcharges, fully reimbursed, plus what he described as, in a voice that cost him considerably, a settlement for the disruption caused. The number was more than she'd calculated the overcharges to be. "I've been in business in this town for 22 years, Halverson said, addressing both of them, but looking mostly at the table. "When Foss came to me and suggested the adjustments, I want to be clear that I understood what I was doing. I told myself it was minor, that it was the kind of thing everyone did, that Cole wasn't watching closely enough to be hurt by it." He stopped, started again. "That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it. I should have said no." Cole said, "Why are you telling us this now?" "Because I think you deserve to know that I made a choice, not a mistake." Halverson's jaw was tight, And because I'm going to testify to that if the prosecutor asks me to. Madeline looked at the bank draft on the table, then at Halverson. He was not a villain in the way that Foss was a villain. He was a smaller and more ordinary kind of wrong, the kind that most communities contain. People who do the easy, harmful thing and find sufficient justification to live with it. That kind of ordinary wrong was harder to address than the dramatic kind because it didn't resolve cleanly and it didn't deserve simple condemnation. "Thank you for coming," she said, "both for the restitution and for what you said." He looked at her, and for a moment she thought there was something in his face close to relief. The particular relief of a person who has been carrying something they shouldn't have been carrying and has finally put it down. He left without much more ceremony, and she and Cole sat with the bank draft on the table between them. "You're not going to say I told you so," Cole said. "When have I ever said that?" "Never," he admitted. "It's one of your more irritating qualities." She picked up the bank draft. "This goes into the herd expansion fund." She looked at him. "Deke's been right about the breeding program. It's time." The breeding program was Deke's idea, and it was a good one. An investment in Hereford Shorthorn crosses that had produced better results in harsher conditions across ranches in the Northern Territories. A strategy that required front-end capital and 5 years of patient development before it paid out significantly. Madeline had been turning the numbers over since February. With the Halverson restitution and the revised loan terms and the Murphy lease income and the projections from the spring cattle sale, the math was possible. Not comfortable, not safe in the way that risk-free decisions are safe, but possible. And the possible things were the ones she'd built her life on doing. She talked it through with Deke for 2 hours on a Tuesday morning, the two of them in the barn with a sketch she'd made of the proposed grazing rotation and the breeding records she'd been pulling from other operations through her correspondence network. Deke listened with the careful attention of a man who has waited a long time to be listened to in return. "You've been wanting to suggest this since before I got here," she said. "Since before Mr. Whitaker's father died," Deke said. "Edmund was a traditional man. Not bad, just he knew what he knew and didn't want to know differently." "And Cole?" Deke looked at her with the particular expression he used for things he'd observed but hadn't been asked about. "Cole has been a different man since fall," he said. It was a simple statement, without editorial, and it landed the way simple, true statements do. "Yes," she agreed. "He has." Cole had changed in ways that were hard to articulate because they were not dramatic. He had not had a revelation or a conversion or a single clear moment of transformation. He had changed the way things change under sustained pressure over time, slowly, in the interior, with the evidence showing up gradually in the way he spoke and the things he asked and the choices he made. He asked her more. Not for permission, Cole would never be a man who asked permission, but for her thinking, her read on situations, her arithmetic. He deferred to her expertise in the areas where she had it without making a production of the deferring. He argued with her in the areas where he disagreed, which she respected more than agreement would have felt. He was not a changed man in the sense of being a different one. He was more fully himself, less defended, less armored against the possibility that someone else might see something he'd missed. She thought that was probably what growth actually looked like most of the time. Not transformation, just the gradual removal of what was in the way. The prosecutor's case against Foss and Brandt moved through the spring and into summer on its own timeline, with occasional communications from Crowell's office updating them on the status. Foss had retained attorneys and was contesting elements of the fraud charges, which was expected. Brandt had attempted initially to characterize his involvement as passive, as a legitimate investor who had relied on Foss's assessments without knowledge of their fraudulent basis. And this characterization had not survived contact with Vera Soan's documented letter and Nathan Pruitt's testimony and the board membership records that linked him directly to the holding company structure. By July, Brandt had reached a settlement with the prosecutor's office. Full admission of involvement, dissolution of all holding companies connected to the scheme, and significant financial penalties paid in part to the affected ranchers. The precise amounts were not public, but the effect was. Gerald Brandt was selling his spread. He did not have the choice to stay. Ryland Foss faced criminal charges that would take longer to resolve and were, Crowell's office indicated, likely to result in conviction on multiple counts. He had left the territory by the time the charges were formally filed, which was a kind of answer in itself. Madeline heard the news about Brant's settlement from Bess Murphy, who came with it the way she always came, with significant information, directly, and with a cup of her own coffee because she didn't trust other people's to be strong enough. They sat on the porch of the ranch house in the early July heat, and Bess told her, and Madeline listened. And when Bess was done, Madeline said, "How's the town taking it?" Bess considered this seriously, which was one of the things Madeline valued about her. "Mixed," she said. "People who liked Brant because he was powerful and it was useful to be on his side, they're recalibrating. People who never liked him much are feeling vindicated. People who are just honest." She paused. "They're mostly thinking about what it means that it ran this long before anyone caught it." "And what does it mean?" Madeline asked. Bess looked at her over the coffee cup. "It means we should have been talking to each other more. It means the way we've always done it. Every ranch its own island, every problem your own problem to carry alone. That doesn't work when someone's willing to use the isolation against you." She paused. "Your network, the correspondence, those 5 other ranchers." "Yes?" "People are talking about it, about doing something more formal, some kind of association." Bess held her gaze. "People are talking about whether you'd be willing to help get it started." Madeline looked out from the porch at Blackthorn Ridge in July. The grass green and actual instead of the dead gold of the winter she'd arrived in. The barn solid and whole, the fence line straight. Harlan was working somewhere on the south side. Walt was visible near the water troughs. Deke was in the new breeding pen with 3 of the Hereford Shorthorn crosses they'd acquired in April, doing the careful daily assessment that the breeding program required. "Yes," she said. "I'd be willing." Iris came down from 40 miles north in August to talk through what an association might look like. She arrived the same way she always did, practically, without ceremony, having thought through most of the important questions before she got there. She and Madeline sat at the kitchen table while Cole and Tom Murphy sat on the porch, and they spent 3 hours building the bones of something that didn't have a name yet but had a shape. It was not complicated in its essential structure. It was a network, formal and documented, through which ranchers in the territory could share information about suppliers, land activity, survey commissions, and financial products. A clearinghouse for the kind of knowledge that prevented the isolation that schemes like Brant and Foss's depended on. Simple, practical, and requiring no central authority beyond the willingness of each member to contribute what they knew and trust that others would do the same. "It's what we should have had 20 years ago," Iris said. "Maybe," Madeline said, "but we have it now." She was elected secretary of the Provisional Association at the first formal meeting in September, in the same feed hall in Caswell, where she'd first laid out the full picture of the fraud. 11 ranchers attended. She had written the agenda and the proposed charter language, and she presented both in plain terms and invited argument, which she got, productively, from people who had opinions and weren't shy about them, which she took as a good sign. Vera Sohan proposed an amendment to the information sharing protocol that was better than Madeline's original language. She accepted it immediately. Pruitt argued against a dues structure and lost, but not badly. The resulting compromise was actually more workable than either original proposal. Frances Albee, the youngest of the group, had brought her teenage son, who sat in the back and listened with the serious attention of someone storing everything away for later use. At the end of the meeting, walking out into the September evening with Cole beside her and the stars just beginning to show above the western horizon, she felt something she hadn't felt since before all of this. Since before the courthouse and the ring and the 6 months of fighting on every surface simultaneously. She felt something uncomplicated. Not happiness exactly, because happiness is too simple a word for what happens when you build something real in hard conditions. Something more like rightness. The feeling of being in the correct place, doing the correct thing, with the correct people. She didn't say this to Cole, but he must have read something of it in her face because he said quietly, "Good meeting." "Yes," she said. "Good meeting." They drove home under a sky that was doing everything with stars that the western sky does in September, extravagant and indifferent, and she thought about what she wanted to say and whether to say it, and decided she would because she'd learned this year that the things you decide not to say have a way of becoming the things you regret. "When I came here," she said, "I want you to know something." "All right," Cole said. He was watching this road, but she could feel his attention shift. I was I was scared, not of you and not of the work. I was scared of building something I actually cared about and having it taken away. She kept her voice even. I had done it before, with the farm, with my family, watched something get built and then just collapse. And I told myself when I came here that I would work for this place, but I wouldn't let myself care about it too much. I would keep some distance. Cole was quiet. I didn't manage that, she said. I cared about it from about the third week. The account books, the barn roof, Deke? A pause. You. The wagon moved through the night, and the stars were there, and the land was there, and Cole was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to leave it where she'd put it, which would have been fine. He was a man who needed time to arrange important things. Then he said, "The ring. What about it?" "The night you came, I threw it on the table." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not quite regret, which is backward-looking, but something more present. "I've thought about that a lot this year, what that said, what I was telling you without saying it." "I knew what you meant," she said. "You were humiliated." "I was. But that's not an excuse for it's not nothing, what I did. You walked in and I threw the ring on the table and told you to put it on, and that was how your marriage started." He paused. "I'm sorry for that. Specifically. That specific thing." She thought about the ring spinning on the table, about picking it up and putting it on, and how her hand hadn't shaken, and how she'd been proud of that at the time, and how the pride of it had felt lonely in a way she hadn't named then. "I know you are," she said. "I've known for a while. I should have said it sooner." "You're saying it now," she said. "That's what matters." They pulled up to Blackthorn Ridge in the late evening, the house lit by a single lamp in the front window that she'd left burning before they went. And Cole took care of the horses, and she went inside and put the kettle on, and thought about everything they'd started and everything they'd built and what it meant and what she wanted to believe about it. Here is what she believed: that most of the important things in a life do not arrive in the forms you expect them in. They arrive sideways, disguised as problems or obligations or catastrophes, wearing the faces of things you didn't choose and wouldn't have chosen. A marriage you were contracted into, a ranch that was failing, a community that had decided what you were before you opened your mouth. These were not the materials of a good story. If you were looking for the kind of story where the right people start with advantages and the deserving are rewarded from the beginning. But life, in her experience, was not that kind of story. Life was the other kind. The kind where the materials you're given are almost never the materials you'd have requested, and the question is only ever what you make from what's actually there. She had made something, not alone. She knew that clearly, had always known it. Iris with her 40 miles and her 3 pages of testimony. Deke with his 12 years and his eventual trust. Walt with his hat in his hands in her kitchen. Tom and Bess Murphy. Vera Sohan and Nathan Pruitt and Frances Albee, and her son sitting in the back of the feed hall storing things away. Cole, learning to listen. Hartwell, writing his letter. Crowell, reading the evidence without looking for reasons to put it down. None of it had been done alone. That was the thing that kept striking her when she thought about it, how the isolation that Brandt and Foss had depended on, the assumption that each person would fight their own battle privately and lose it quietly, had been the thing she'd refused from the beginning. Not out of strategy at first, just out of the instinct that problems with patterns require people who are willing to see the pattern together. Cole came in from the barn. He washed his hands and came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back at him, and it was not a dramatic moment. It was just a Tuesday evening in September, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood and the particular smell of a house that is being lived in properly, which is different from the smell of a house that is just being occupied. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What?" "The East Pasture. Spring." He came and sat down. "If the breeding program holds the way Deke says it should, in 3 years we're going to need more grazing rotation than we currently have room for." She looked at him. "You're thinking about expansion." "I'm thinking about whether we look at the Brandt land when it comes available, through proper channels, at fair price. Not because we need it, because it's adjacent and it makes sense, and because—" He stopped. "Because it would be the end of that particular story," she said. "Something like that." She thought about it. The Brandt land, acquired through legal purchase at fair market value after everything. It was not revenge. It was too practical for revenge. It was just a rancher looking at a piece of adjacent land and thinking about what could be done with it. Put together the numbers, she said. We'll look at it in the spring when we know what the sale process looks like. Cole nodded. He picked up the coffee she'd poured for him and drank it, and outside the September night settled over Blackthorn Ridge, with the particular stillness of a place that has been fought for and held. Years later, and there were years, full and specific and uneven in the way of all real years, Blackthorn Ridge became something that people in the territory pointed to when they talked about what was possible. Not because it was the largest operation or the most dramatic story, or because it had all gone smoothly, because it hadn't. The cattle operation expanded in stages, some of which worked better than projected and some of which didn't, and there were dry summers and sick calves and a fence fire in the fourth year that cost them a full section of pasture and 3 weeks of brutal recovery work. There was a disagreement between Madeline and Deke in the fifth year about the grazing rotation that lasted 2 months and was resolved in Deke's favor, which she acknowledged without difficulty because she'd been wrong and she knew how to say so. Cole's mother came to visit in the second year and stayed for a month, which was informative in the way that meeting a person's family is always informative. It explained some things and raised questions about others, and the two women arrived at a civil and practical relationship that was neither warm nor hostile, which was its own kind of achievement. Madeline's father came once, the third summer, and walked the property in a silence that she recognized as his version of being moved. He said, at the end of the day, sitting on the porch while the light went long across the pasture, "I didn't know you could do this." "I didn't either," she said. "Not for certain." He looked at her with the complicated face of a parent who has failed a child in specific ways and knows it and doesn't know how to close the distance. "I'm sorry about the contract," he said. "About how it—" "Pa." She said it gently. "It brought me here." I can't be sorry it happened." He nodded slowly and looked back at the pasture, and they sat there together in the kind of quiet that has years in it and doesn't need to be filled. The Ranchers Association formalized in the third year with a membership of 31 operations across 4 counties and a charter that Madeline had helped write and which was, by the time of its ratification, better than her original draft in nearly every section, because 31 ranchers with opinions had improved it considerably, and she'd let them. It did the thing it was designed to do. It gave isolated people a way to see patterns, to share what they knew, to be less alone in the specific way that makes exploitation possible. It didn't prevent all bad things. Nothing does. But it changed the conditions under which bad things could quietly compound, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, the point. She was 35 when the regional agricultural paper ran a piece about the association and included an interview with her. The journalist was a young woman from the capital who arrived with a notebook and good questions and a slight uncertainty about what she was walking into, and Madeline gave her 2 hours and straight answers and didn't perform anything for the record that she didn't actually believe. The piece was well regarded. She received letters about it for months, from other women in difficult situations in other territories, from ranchers who recognized the pattern she'd described, from a man in Kansas City who turned out to be a researcher compiling records on land fraud schemes in the post-Railroad West, and who asked permission to cite her documentation. She said yes. Cole read the piece twice and said, "They got the part about the breeding program wrong. We started it in the spring, not the fall." "I know," she said. "I told her spring. She wrote fall." "Do you want to write a correction?" "Not particularly," she said. "Spring or fall, the calves are the same." He looked at her over the paper. "You're very calm about this." "About a minor factual error in a piece that otherwise accurately describes 7 years of work?" "Yes." She looked back at him. "I have things to do today, Cole." He almost smiled. He was better at actually smiling by the 7th year. Not frequently, and not on demand, but genuinely, in the moments that earned it. It had become one of her favorite sights, specific and real, belonging entirely to him. This is what she knew, having lived through what she'd lived through, having built what she'd built with the people who'd helped her build it, that strength is rarely what it looks like from the outside. From the outside, it looks like certainty, like a person who knew what they were doing and moved forward without doubt. From the inside, it is entirely different. From the inside, it is making the next decision with imperfect information, and the next one, and the next one, and not stopping when people expect you to stop, and not needing them to see what you see before you act on it. She had not arrived at Blackthorn Ridge knowing how to do what she did. She had arrived with a bag and a skill with numbers and a refusal to treat the situation as fixed, and she had learned everything else in the doing of it, which is how most things worth knowing get learned. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed to be in a position where her abilities mattered, and she had built that position from a ring thrown on a table and a rotting barn roof and a set of account books that nobody had bothered to read carefully. The land was real, the work was real, the people were real, flawed and difficult and specific in the ways of actual people, rather than the simplified versions of people that stories often produce. Deke with his standards and his eventual trust, Walt with his pride and his hat in his hands, Iris, steady and 40 miles north, Cole, learning to let himself be known. None of it had been easy. None of it had resolved cleanly. There was a lawsuit still pending in the 10th year over a grazing boundary dispute with a neighboring property that had nothing to do with Brant and everything to do with the ordinary complications of shared terrain and differing records. Deke retired at 68 and his replacement was not as good, at first, which cost them a difficult season before the man found his footing. There were conversations she and Cole hadn't finished yet, things still being worked out between two people who had started from obligation and arrived somewhere neither of them had a map for. But the land was there, and the people were there, and the things she'd built, not just the ranch, but the network, the association, the way of approaching problems as collective rather than individual. That was there too, running on its own momentum now, larger than any one person's effort. She did not need to be remembered for it. That had never been the point. The point was the doing of it, the putting of her mind and her hands on the problems in front of her and not stopping until they either yielded or she understood exactly what they required. The willingness to be the person who looked at what was actually there, even when what was actually there was frightening and large and tangled and not what anyone had prepared her for. She had walked into a broken world, a broken house, a broken marriage, a broken community, a broken economy of small ranches being quietly eaten from underneath. And she had done what she could with what she had, and what she could do had turned out to be more than anyone, including her, had known at the start. That was not a miracle. That was just a person, paying attention and not stopping. And on an evening in late September, with the light going gold across the east pasture and the cattle moving slow toward the water troughs and Cole coming in from the barn with his coat on, and that particular expression that meant the day had been good in the ordinary way of good days, Madeline Whitaker, secretary of the Territorial Ranchers Association, co-owner of Blackthorn Ridge, the bride nobody wanted, sat on her porch and looked at what she had made and found it sufficient and found herself exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had put her there, because she had walked there herself, one difficult step at a time, and had not once turned back.